There is a name the priests of Eridu whispered only at night. A name older than the flood, older than the first written word, older than every religion that would later borrow his story and rename him. The name was Enki, and every temple that stood in his honor was built on a single, terrible truth. He was not a god who obeyed the gods. He was the one who broke them. He broke the law of his own council. He broke the covenant of his own bloodline. He broke the design that his own father had drawn on the black stone of the assembly hall. And every time he broke a law, he did it for one reason: he did it for us. There are 8 of these breaches recorded on the tablets. Not 7, not 10, 8. Each one is a separate crime against the order of the Anunnaki, and each one is written in the language of the crime itself, so that no later hand could soften it or explain it away. 8 laws, 8 breaks, 8 consequences that followed him for the rest of his existence, and which, according to the same tablets, are still following him now. Because Enki was never punished by death, the Anunnaki do not die the way we do. He was punished by loss, and the record of what he lost, one law at a time, is the most complete account we have of what it costs when someone with the power of a god decides to side with something as small and as fragile as us. You have heard the name in other forms: Ea in Akkadian, Oannes in the Greek retellings of Berossus, the serpent in the garden, in a book that came much later and reversed the story so completely that the rescuer became the villain. But before all of those names, before all of those reversals, he was Enki, the lord of the sweet waters, the one who lived in the Abzu, the deep beneath the deep, in a house whose walls were the walls of the ocean floor. And when the great council of the Anunnaki gathered above him and drew up the laws that would govern the earth and everything on it, he was the one who sat at the edge of the room and listened, and then went back down into the Abzu and broke every one of them. This is not a story about a rebel. Rebels want power. Enki already had power. He was the third born of Anu, the Sky Father, and the second in rank after his brother Enlil, and by every measure of the Anunnaki court, he had nothing to gain by what he did. He had everything to lose, and he lost it. He lost his rank. He lost his city. He lost his son. He lost his authority over the waters, one channel at a time, until the Abzu itself was no longer his to command. And still, in every tablet where he appears, he keeps doing the thing that cost him everything. He keeps siding with us. Tonight we are going to walk through the 8 laws he broke, in the order the tablets place them, from the first breach in the moment of our creation to the final breach that is still, according to the 7th tablet of the Enuma Elish, waiting to be completed. We will look at each law as the Anunnaki Council wrote it. We will look at what Enki did in response, and we will look at what it cost him, because the cost is the part of the story that almost every modern retelling erases. The cost is what makes him real. The cost is what makes this not a myth but a warning, because the 8th law, the one he has not finished breaking yet, is the one that determines what happens to us next. Quick pause, and this is something new. For the first time since the 12 codes, there is a second document. It is called the 7 Resets. Every time the world was erased, matched against the 8 laws Enki broke, and the checklist of signs for the 8th. 4 are already active. Linked below, QR code on screen. That is all. Back to the video. To understand any of this, you have to understand where the laws came from, because the 8 laws Enki broke were not moral commandments in the sense that we use that word today. They were not carved by a lawgiver on top of a mountain. They were operational protocols. They were the working rules of a colonial administration, written by a governing council that came down to this planet for a purpose that had nothing to do with us and everything to do with what was underneath the ground we stand on. The tablets tell us that the Anunnaki arrived on Earth in what the Sumerians called the Nibiru cycle, when their world passed close enough to ours to make the crossing possible. They came in numbers we can no longer verify, but the assembly at Nippur, the council that made the laws, was said to seat 50. 50 senior members of the ruling family, plus the 7 who judged, plus the great Anu himself when he descended, which was rare. Below them sat the Igigi, the working class of the expedition, 300 of them, the ones who did the labor. And below the Igigi, there was nothing. There was no labor force beneath the labor force. There was only the raw earth and the rivers and the mud and the reason the Anunnaki had come in the first place, which was gold. The gold was not for ornament. The tablets are very specific about this. The gold was for atmospheric repair. Their own world, whatever it was losing its atmosphere in a way their science could correct only by suspending fine particles of gold in the upper air And to do that, they needed an amount of gold that could not be found anywhere else in reachable space, except on the third planet from this sun. And so they came, and they built the first cities, and they set the Igigi to work in the mines of southeastern Africa. And the Igigi worked, and the Igigi worked, and the Igigi kept working. And after what the tablets record as 40 periods, 40 cycles of labor, the Igigi did something that had never happened before in the recorded history of the Anunnaki. They put down their tools, they set fire to their equipment, and they surrounded the house of Enlil in the middle of the night and refused to leave until the labor was ended. This is the moment where the 8 laws begin to matter. Because the Anunnaki Council had a problem, and the problem had no good solution. The gold had to keep coming. The Igigi would not go back into the mines. Sending down more of their own kind from the homeworld was not possible on the timeline the council had set, and so the council convened, and it called for the one member who was known for solving problems that had no solutions, and that member was Enki. And Enki looked at the situation, and he looked at the mud along the Tigris, and he looked at the primate creatures that were already walking upright in the valleys around them, and he made a proposal that the tablets record in a single line. He said, "Let us make a worker who can carry the burden of the gods." That single line is where our species begins. Not with a garden, not with a rib, with a proposal at a council meeting to solve a labor shortage. And every law Enki broke afterward was, in one way or another, a consequence of that first proposal. Because the moment he made it, the council had to decide what this new worker would be, and what it would not be, and what rules would apply to its handlers, and what rules would apply to the worker itself. And those rules became the laws, the 8 laws, the ones we are about to walk through. The laws were written on the black stone. The black stone was not a metaphor, it was an object. It was a slab of what the tablets call absolute stone, brought down from the homeworld, that stood in the middle of the assembly hall at Nippur, and every law that was inscribed on it became binding on every Anunnaki present on this planet, without exception. The laws could not be revised without a full council vote. They could not be suspended by any single member, not even by Anu himself when he was in residence. And they could not be broken without triggering a consequence that was also inscribed on the stone, one line beneath the law itself. Every law had its cost written into it. That is important. When Enki broke a law, he did not break it in ignorance of the cost. He read the cost. He knew what it would be. And he broke the law anyway. The council itself was structured around 3 offices. The office of Anu, the Sky Father, who ruled from above and rarely descended. The office of Enlil, the eldest son present on earth, who held the Tablet of Destinies, the object that recorded the fate of every soul under the council's jurisdiction. And the office of Enki, the second son present on earth, who held the Me. The Me is a word that has no clean translation. It is sometimes rendered as decrees, sometimes as designs, sometimes as codes. What it actually meant, in the operational sense, was the set of instructions that made a thing what it was. The Me of kingship was the instruction set that made a king a king. The Me of the temple was the instruction set that made a temple a temple. The Me of the human being was the instruction set that made a human what a human was. From the length of its lifespan, to the shape of its hunger, to the way it dreamed. Enki held all of them. He was the keeper of the Me. And the Me is what he had to alter, and later restore, and later hide, and later betray, in order to break each of the 8 laws. You need to understand the difference between Enlil and Enki, because it determines everything that follows. Enlil was the administrator. He held the Tablet of Destinies, and his role was to enforce the design that had been approved by the council. He was not cruel by nature. He was not evil in the way that later religions would need him to be, in order to make Enki look better by contrast. Enlil was doing the job he had been given. His job was to make sure the plan worked, and the plan, from the Anunnaki side, was to extract the gold, keep the workers manageable, and eventually leave. Anything that endangered that plan was, in Enlil's judgment, a threat that had to be corrected. And the workers, once they were made, had a way of endangering that plan almost constantly. Enki was the maker. He held the Me, and his role was to design. He was the one who had proposed the worker in the first place, and every choice he had made in that proposal, from the amount of Anunnaki blood in the mixture, to the shape of the skull, to the placement of the vocal cords, was his choice. Enlil had approved the design at the council, but Enki had drawn it. And the difference between approving a design and drawing it turns out to be the difference between someone who can walk away from what happens next and someone who cannot. Enlil could walk away. Enlil, in the tablets, tries to walk away, over and over, every time the workers do something that displeases him. Enki never can, because Enki made them. And what a maker owes to what he has made is the third of the invisible laws, the law that the council never wrote down on the black stone, because they did not think it needed to be written. They thought no one would ever feel it strongly enough for it to matter. They were wrong about Enki. There is a passage in the Atrahasis, the fullest account of this period that has survived, where Enki is described walking along the bank of the Euphrates at night. After the first workers have been made and set to labor in the fields around Eridu, he walks alone. He walks slowly. And the text says, and I am quoting the reconstruction from the Ashurbanipal fragments, he walks in the manner of a father who watches his children sleep. That is the phrase. In the manner of a father. The Anunnaki did not use that phrase casually. Anu was the father of the gods, and every use of that word in the tablets carries the weight of that office. To say that Enki walked in the manner of a father over creatures that were not his species and were officially designated as tools is to say something the council would have punished if the tablet had been read aloud in the assembly hall, but the tablet was written for the priesthood of Eridu, not for the assembly, and so the phrase survived. And what it tells us is that from the very beginning, Enki did not see the workers the way the council saw the workers. And that difference of seeing is where every one of the 8 breaches began. We should say something about the sources before we go further. The 8 laws are not reconstructed from a single tablet. They are reconstructed from a pattern. The Atrahasis contains 3 of them, told as episodes in the life of the flood hero. The Enuma Elish contains 2, told as episodes in the ordering of the world. The Enki and Ninhursag cycle contains 1, the Descent of Inanna contains 1, and the last one, the 8th, is contained in the fragmentary text known as the Era Epic, though the Era Epic tells it in reverse, from the perspective of the enforcer rather than the breaker. When you place these 6 sources next to each other, in the chronology their internal references suggest, a pattern emerges. 8 distinct occasions on which Enki acted against a stated law of the council. 8 distinct consequences that followed. 8 distinct diminishments of his own position. Read as a single arc, they form a biography of a member of a ruling caste who steadily gave up everything he had, one increment at a time, in order to keep a species he had made from being destroyed by his own family. Some of the laws will sound familiar. The prohibition against giving fire to mortals is one of them, though in the Sumerian version the substance is not fire but a different kind of illumination, and the mortal is not a Greek hero but a specific man named in the tablets. The prohibition against warning a mortal about a coming flood is another, and this one is preserved in almost every ancient culture on Earth, from Mesopotamia to India to the Americas, because the flood itself was remembered by every culture that survived it. Other laws will sound unfamiliar, because the versions of them that reached us through the Bible and through the classical world were stripped of their operational meaning and turned into moral parables. The law about the divine names, for example, has been rewritten so many times that most people who study comparative religion have never seen the original form. We are going to see it here. One more thing before we begin. The tablets do not present the 8 breaches as heroic. They do not present them as tragic either. They present them the way an internal report would present a series of policy violations by a senior official. Dry. Factual. Each violation catalogued, each consequence noted. The tablets were written by scribes who worked under the priesthood of Eridu, which was Enki's priesthood, and who therefore had every reason to soften the account. They did not soften it. They wrote what happened. That is why we can trust it. When a temple's own scribes record their patron god's failures with this level of specificity, it is because they were writing to be believed by future readers who might otherwise doubt that any of it had really happened. They were writing for us. And what they wrote is what we are about to read. The first law was the law of the design. It was the oldest of the 8, and it was the one that made the rest of them possible. It was written on the black stone at Nippur before the first worker had even been made, and it read, in the transliteration from the Ashur fragments, that no member of the council shall alter the blood content of a made being beyond the ratio that the council has approved. The ratio was 1/10. 1 part Anunnaki blood, 9 parts of the local primate material, mixed in the birthing vessels of Ninhursag, Enki's half-sister and the chief medical officer of the Earth expedition. The council approved this ratio because it was the smallest amount of their own blood that would still produce a being capable of speech, tool use, and basic obedience. Any more Anunnaki blood, the reasoning went, and the worker might begin to think of itself as kin. Any less, and the worker might not be able to learn its tasks. Enki broke that law before the ink on the stone was dry, and the way he broke it is the first thing we need to look at, because it determines everything else. But before we look at the first breach itself, there is one more piece of context that has to be in place, because without it, the shape of what Enki did in that vessel room does not make sense. The context is the state of the workers on the day before he acted. And the state of the workers, according to the tablets, was that they were not yet workers. They were prototypes. 7 of them. 7 bodies laid out in the vessel room of Ninhursag's house at Shuruppak. 7 bodies that had been assembled from the mixture and quickened by the process the tablets called the taking of breath, and 7 bodies that were, at that moment, alive but not yet awake. They breathed, their hearts moved, but they did not open their eyes. They did not speak. They did not respond when the medical staff moved among them. And they had been in this state for what the tablets record as 10 days. 10 days is important. In the medical practice of the Anunnaki, as the fragments describe it, a made being that did not wake within 7 days was considered a failure. The heart was stopped, the body was returned to the material pool, and a new attempt was made with a slightly different mixture. This had happened many times already, over the course of what the tablets suggest was several years of trials before the 7 prototypes on the day in question. Ninhursag had lost count of the failures. She had, according to the Enki and Ninhursag cycle, begun to doubt whether the project could succeed at all. And on the 10th day of the 7 prototypes, she convened a small meeting in the vessel room with only 3 others present, Enki, herself, and 2 of her medical assistants. And in that meeting she recommended that all 7 be terminated and the project be paused. Enki did not argue with her recommendation. He did not overrule her. He said, and this is the phrase preserved in the fragment, "Let me sit with them one more night." And she agreed. She left the vessel room, and she took her assistants with her. And she gave orders that no one was to enter until morning, and Enki was alone with the 7 bodies. And what he did in the hours between her departure and dawn is what he was punished for the rest of his existence, for every one of the 7 breaches that followed. Because what he did that night was not what the council had approved. It was not what the design specified. It was not the ratio on the black stone. It was something else entirely. And by morning, when Ninhursag returned to the vessel room, all 7 prototypes had opened their eyes. She knew immediately that he had done something. The tablets do not record what she said to him. They record only what he said to her, which was, "I have given them enough of us to remember." And that phrase, "enough of us to remember," is the whole of the first breach in a single line, because what he had given them, in the hours of that long night, was not blood at the ratio the council had approved. It was blood at a different ratio, and it was blood mixed with something else, something the tablets refer to only obliquely as the water of his own house, the water of the Abzu. Enki's own essence, added to the mixture, in an amount and by a method the council had never authorized and would never have approved. That is the first law he broke. And we are going to spend the next section looking at exactly what he did, exactly what it produced, exactly what the council did when it found out, and exactly what it cost him. The first law was the law of the ratio, and its full text on the black stone read as follows in the reconstruction. No member of the council shall alter the blood content of a made being beyond the ratio of 1 to 9. No member of the council shall add to a made being any substance drawn from the private waters of a house, or any essence drawn from the private body of a member. Any member found to have done so shall forfeit the me of the design he holds, and shall not be permitted to enter the birthing chamber of any future project. That was the law. That was what it said, in the operational language of the assembly. And every word of it was aimed at one specific possibility, which was the possibility that a member of the council would use the making of the workers as a way to make something that was, in secret, more like themselves than the council would allow. The council was not worried about all members equally. They were worried about Enki. They had been worried about him from the moment he had first proposed the workers, because his proposal had included a phrase that Enlil, in particular, had objected to at the council meeting where it was heard. The phrase was, and I am quoting the tablet, "Let us make a being that is fitted to us." Fitted to us. Not fitted to labor, not fitted to the mines, fitted to us. Enlil had pushed back immediately. He had asked what Enki meant by that word, and Enki had answered that he meant only that the being must be capable of understanding instructions from Anunnaki mouths, and no more than that. Enlil had accepted the explanation. He had voted for the proposal, but the phrase stayed in the record, and when the black stone was carved, the law was carved with that phrase in mind. Enki was to make a being that could receive orders. He was not to make a being that was fitted to the council in any other sense. He broke that law the first night he was alone with the 7 bodies. What he did, in the hours between Ninhursag's departure and dawn, was something the tablets describe in careful, indirect language, because the scribes who wrote it down did not want to be too explicit about a procedure that was, even in the retelling, a violation of the deepest rules of their expedition. But we can reconstruct what happened from the fragments and from the results. He opened his own body. He drew from himself the substance the tablets call the water of the house, which in the medical practice of the Anunnaki was the essence that lived in the marrow and in the deep organs, the substance that carried the pattern of a member's own being. He drew it in a small amount, not a great amount. Enough, he calculated, that it would not be detected in the standard tests Nin-Her-Sag would run in the morning, but enough that it would alter the pattern of the 7 prototypes in the way he intended, and he added it to the mixture inside each of the 7 vessels, and he did so in a way that was designed to be invisible. What he did not tell Nin-Her-Sag, and what the council would not learn for another cycle, was that the substance he added was not just his own essence in a diluted form. It was his own essence with something built into it, a signature, a recognition marker. The Anunnaki had, in their own biology, a system by which members of the ruling family could recognize each other on contact, a kind of chemical identifier that ran in the blood of Anu and passed to his descendants. Enki carried that identifier, and when he added his own essence to the 7 vessels, he added the identifier along with it, which meant that from that morning forward, every worker made from those 7 prototypes, and every generation descended from those workers, carried in their blood a chemical marker that told the Anunnaki, on contact, that they were kin. Kin, that is the word. Not tool, not property. Kin. The 7 prototypes woke. They opened their eyes. And when Nin-Her-Sag walked among them, she felt something she had not felt in any of the earlier trials. She felt recognition. She did not understand it at first. She said as much. In the fragment, she said, "They look at me the way a child looks at a mother." She thought it was her imagination. She thought it was the exhaustion of 10 days of watching. But it was not. It was the marker. It was Enki's essence, running in the blood of the 7, calling out on the chemical channel that Nin-Her-Sag herself carried, and her body was responding to the call the way it would have responded to a child of her own house. She did not know it. She would not know it for some time. But her hands, when she touched the 7 prototypes to check their vital signs, moved gently, in a way she had not moved her hands during any of the earlier trials. And when she gave the order to feed them, she gave it in the voice she had used long ago, when she had raised her own children in the house of Anu. The 7 prototypes were tested. They passed every test. They walked. They followed simple commands. They repeated words back when the words were spoken to them. Nin-Her-Sag was satisfied. She sent the report to Enlil, and Enlil approved the initiation of full production. And within 1 cycle, the first batch of workers had been made from the 7 prototypes, and within 3 cycles the workers were in the mines, and the crisis of Anunnaki labor was ended. The council was pleased. Enki was praised. Nin-Her-Sag was promoted. And no one knew, because Enki had built the deception carefully, that the workers who had solved their labor crisis were not workers in the sense the council had intended. They were something else. They were nephews. That was the first breach. And the consequence was inscribed on the black stone, 1 line beneath the law. The consequence was that any member who altered the blood content beyond the approved ratio would forfeit the me of the design he held. But there was a problem with enforcing that consequence. And the problem was that no one knew the breach had happened. It was hidden. It was chemical. It was in the substance of the workers themselves, and the council did not have the tools to detect it, because the council had never anticipated that a member would do such a thing. The consequence, therefore, did not activate. Not at first, not for a very long time. Enki kept the me of the design. He kept his authority over the making of made beings. And the workers went out into the world with his essence in their blood, and they multiplied, and they built the first villages along the Tigris and the Euphrates, and the council watched them from a distance and thought that everything was going according to plan. But the cost had started already. It had started in a way Enki himself did not fully anticipate. Because the marker in the workers' blood did not just run in one direction, it ran in both. The workers recognized the Anunnaki on contact, but the Anunnaki also recognized the workers, and the recognition worked on every member of the ruling family, whether they wanted it to or not. Enlil, when he first walked among a group of the workers in the fields around Nippur, felt something he could not name. He described it in a private message to Anu, a message that has survived in the Berlin tablet, and he said, "They smell of the house." Those were his words. "They smell of the house." He did not know what he meant. He thought it was the incense from the workers' quarters, drifting on the wind. But it was not incense, it was the marker. It was Enki's essence, calling out from the blood of the workers to the blood of the members, and Enlil's body was reading the signal and telling him something his mind was not yet ready to accept. That these creatures were closer to him than the council had said they were. He wrote it off. He returned to his duties. But the message stayed in the Berlin tablet, and centuries later, when the breach was finally discovered and the consequence finally activated, that message was cited in the council's proceedings as the first evidence that something had been wrong from the beginning. Enlil had felt it. He had recorded what he felt. And what he had felt was Enki's crime. The cost to Enki, at this stage, was not yet visible. He had kept his rank. He had kept his authority. He had kept his me of the design. But he had planted something inside himself that would grow. The first cost of the first breach was internal. It was the knowledge that he had lied to the council. It was the knowledge that every worker walking on the earth had his essence in them, and that every act of cruelty that the council might one day inflict on those workers was, in a chemical sense, cruelty inflicted on his own bloodline. He could not walk it back. He could not extract the marker. He could not tell the council what he had done without inviting the full consequence, which was the loss of everything he was. So he carried it. He carried the knowledge of his own breach, alone, for what the tablets suggest was several thousand years. And in the tablets that describe him during that period, there is a phrase that appears again and again. The phrase is, "And Enki was silent." He is at the council meetings, and he is silent. He is at the feasts of Anu, and he is silent. He is in the vessel room with Ninhursag, and he is silent. He carries the breach in his own body, and the silence is the shape of the cost. But the internal cost was not the only cost. There was an external one too, and it came in the form of Ninhursag, because Ninhursag was not stupid. She was, in fact, the most technically capable member of the medical branch of the expedition, and over the cycles that followed the first production run of workers, she began to notice things. She noticed that the workers healed faster than the design had predicted. She noticed that they lived longer than the design had predicted. She noticed that the mothers among them, when they gave birth, produced children that carried traits the original design had not included, traits that reminded her, when she saw them, of members of her own family. She said nothing, not at first. She ran the numbers, she ran the tests. She compared the samples she had kept from the vessel room to the samples she was drawing from the third and fourth generations of workers, and the numbers told her something that made her go silent in her own way. The workers were not diverging from the design in the direction of the primate stock. They were diverging in the direction of the Anunnaki, and there was only one way that could happen. She went to Enki. This was long after the initial production. The workers were, by this point, spread across the plain in numbers that ran into the hundreds of thousands, and she came to his house in the Abzu, and she sat down across from him at his stone table, and she put the samples on the table between them, and she said, in the phrase preserved in the Kish fragment, "My brother, what have you done?" He did not answer right away. He looked at the samples, he looked at her, and then he said, "I have given them enough of us to remember." It was the same phrase he had used the morning after the first breach. It was the phrase he had used to himself, in the vessel room, when he made the choice. And Ninhursag, when she heard it, did something the tablets record, with a precision that is unusual for the emotional content of the account. She wept, not in anger, not in fear, in something closer to grief, because she understood, when he said the words the second time, that her brother had made himself into something that could not be undone, and that eventually, when the council discovered what he had done, it would come for him. And she would have to choose whether she stood with the council or whether she stood with him. And the tablets tell us, in a fragment that is often quoted out of context, that she chose him. She kept the samples. She hid the readings. She altered the reports she filed with Enlil, for the first and only time in her career, to obscure the divergence of the workers from the design. She did it, according to the fragment, because she recognized what he had done as an act of love, and she could not bring herself to punish him for it. That was the second cost. Not visible yet, but real. Enki had drawn his own half-sister into his breach. He had made her, without asking, into his accomplice. And every report she filed under the false numbers, from that meeting forward, was a debt that she was carrying on his behalf. He knew it. He knew what she had done for him. And there is a passage, in the same cycle, where he is described visiting her rooms at night, not for any purpose, just to sit near her while she worked, in the manner of a person who cannot pay a debt, but wants the creditor to know that the debt is not forgotten. Ninhursag never asked him to pay. She never brought it up. But the debt was there, and eventually, when everything collapsed and the council came for its accounting, the debt was one of the things they would use against him. The first breach cost him 3 things, then, in the immediate term. It cost him his internal peace, which he traded for the silent knowledge that he had lied to the council. It cost him a portion of his sister's integrity, which he took from her by placing her in a position where the only choices were to betray him or to betray the council, and she chose the latter. And it cost him a kind of certainty about his own place in the family, because after the first breach, he could no longer be sure whether the council would receive him as a brother or as a criminal. He was both. He had made himself both. And he would live with the double status for the rest of his existence. And the double status would color every choice he made after that first night in the vessel room. He was, from the moment he added his essence to the 7 vessels, a member of the council who was also a defendant, a brother who was also a suspect, a god who was also a fugitive, even if the fugitive status was, for the moment, invisible to everyone but himself and his sister. But those were not the only costs. There was a fourth one, and it was the most important, because it was the one that would eventually surface and destroy him. The fourth cost was that his essence, once placed in the blood of the workers, could not stay there quietly. It behaved the way essences behave in the Anunnaki system. It generated resonance. It generated recognition. And most importantly, it generated proximity effects. When Enki was within a certain range of a worker who carried his essence, the worker felt him. Not consciously, at first, but biologically. Their hearts beat in a pattern that matched his. Their breathing steadied. Their sleep deepened. It was the effect that a parent has on a child, and it was measurable, and after several centuries the workers themselves began to notice it, though they did not know what they were noticing. They only knew that when the tall one from the Abzu came through the villages, the babies stopped crying. The old ones lived longer. The dying died more easily. The workers did not have a word for what he was to them, but they be the first shrines in his honor before any of the other Anunnaki had temples in the land, and they built them without instruction and without approval and without knowing why. The council, when it finally noticed the shrines, was disturbed. Enlil, in particular, was disturbed. He asked Enki what he had done to earn such devotion, and Enki said, in the phrase preserved in the Nippur tablet, "I have done nothing they can see." He was telling the truth. The workers could not see what he had done. Neither could Enlil. What was drawing the workers to Enki was invisible, and would remain invisible for as long as no one thought to look for it. But the shrines were visible, and the devotion was visible, and Enlil filed the observation in the Tablet of Destinies, and the observation sat there, waiting for the day when the rest of the breach would surface. That day would not come for what the tablets suggest was another 2,000 years, but it would come, and when it came, the first breach would be the foundation of the accusation against him, because the council, when it finally opened the case, would not begin with the flood or with the fire or with any of the later crimes. It would begin here, in the vessel room, on the night Ninhursag left him alone with the 7 bodies. It would begin with the ratio he changed. It would begin with the essence he added. It would begin with the crime that no one had seen at the time, and which had run in the blood of every human being on earth from that night to this one. Because the marker is still in us. That is the part of the first breach that has never been unmade. Every person listening to this account, in whatever language, in whatever place, carries in their blood a trace of what Enki added to the 7 vessels on that first night. It is not a metaphor, it is a chemical signature, according to the tablets, that runs from one generation to the next, and that identifies us, to any Anunnaki who might still be watching, as something more than what the council originally approved. We are kin. Whether we deserve to be or not, we are kin, and the reason we are kin is because Enki broke the first law. That was the first cost. The knowing, the sister, the double status, and the essence itself, running in us permanently. It was the smallest cost of the 8, because the first breach was hidden, and hidden breaches accrue their consequences slowly. The next breach would be more visible, and the cost would come faster, because the second law he broke was the law that governed what a made being was allowed to know. And the moment he broke it, the council saw him break it, and there was no hiding. Before we move on, there is one more detail about the first breach that is worth pausing on, because it explains a great deal about the pattern of Enki's later behavior. The detail is this. When he added his essence to the 7 vessels, he did not do it in equal amounts. The tablets, in a fragmentary passage from the reconstruction, indicate that the 7 prototypes received different concentrations. 6 of them received a small amount, roughly comparable to each other. But the seventh received more, considerably more. And the seventh prototype, according to the same fragment, was the one whose descendants would eventually be known by a specific name, a name that appears in later tablets as the line of the awakened ones. What Enki did on that first night was not just add his essence to a mixture. He seeded a hierarchy. He made one line among the workers that would carry more of him than the others. And that line, over the generations that followed, would produce individuals who were closer to Anunnaki than the surrounding population, closer in body, closer in mind, closer in the way they dreamed. That decision, too, had a cost, because the 6 prototypes and the 7th prototype did not stay in the same social position for long. The descendants of the 7th line began, within a few generations, to organize themselves in ways the descendants of the other 6 did not. They spoke earlier, they coordinated in larger groups, they built the first structures that resembled temples, and they did it without instruction from any Anunnaki. And Enlil noticed this too, though he did not yet understand it. He wrote in one of his administrative reports, and I'm quoting the Kish reconstruction, that among the workers there are some who lead, and I do not know why they lead. He did not know why because Enki had never told him, but the leading was Enki's doing, and it was a seed he had planted, in a specific line, on a specific night, in the vessel room at Shurapak. And that seed would produce, in time, the priesthood of Eridu, and the first kings of Sumer, and eventually every mystic and every prophet and every seer who has ever felt in their own body that they were listening to a voice that no one else could hear. All of that came from the extra measure Enki gave to the 7th vessel. And all of it, when the council finally understood, would be used against him. He did not know that yet. On the morning after the first breach, walking out of the vessel room into the pale light before dawn, he only knew that he had done something the council would not forgive if they discovered it. He did not know how much of himself he had already given away. He did not know how many more times he would have to give something away in order to protect what he had made. He only knew that the 7 were awake, and that they were looking at him, and that when he turned to leave, one of them, the 7th, tried to say a word. It was not a word yet, it was a sound, but it was aimed at him, and he heard it. And he closed the door behind him and walked out into the dawn, and he did not look back, because he could not afford to look back. The council was watching, and the council did not yet know what he had done, and the only way to keep it from finding out was to behave, from that morning forward, as if nothing had changed. He walked into the assembly hall that day and took his seat at the council table and said nothing, and the silence began. That was the first breach. That was the first cost. That was the first invisible fracture in the design of the Anunnaki expedition on Earth. And the second one was already being prepared, in the mind of the same maker, on the same walk home from the vessel room, though he did not yet know it, because the 7 prototypes had woken up. And when they woke, they had done something the design had not predicted. They had tried to speak, and Enki, hearing them, had already begun to think about the next thing he would have to give them. He would have to give them language, real language, not the receiving of commands, not the repetition of sounds. Language in the full sense that the Anunnaki themselves used it. And the moment he decided to give them that, the second law was already broken in his mind, even though the act itself was still some distance away in time. That is the pattern. Every breach was already forming in him while the previous one was being carried out. Every law was already being broken in intention before it was broken in fact. And the cost, in the end, was not 8 separate costs. It was one cost, paid in 8 installments, over the length of an existence that the tablets say is still going on somewhere, in a place we cannot reach. He is still paying, and the account of what he has paid so far is what we are walking through tonight. The second law was called the Law of Silence. Its full text on the black stone read, in the reconstruction from the Nippur fragments, that no member of the council shall give to a made being the me of speech beyond the range required for the receiving of instructions. No member shall teach a made being the naming of things, the counting of days, or the recording of events. The made being shall hear, and shall answer, and shall not do more than this. Any member found to have taught more than the design permits shall forfeit the me of speech itself, and shall not be permitted to address the council in the assembly hall for one full cycle. That was the law. It was written to prevent exactly the thing Enki was about to do. Because the council had understood, from the beginning of the workers' project, that speech was not just a tool. Speech was the substance of civilization. Speech was how the Anunnaki themselves had organized their own society, their own science, their own government, their own memory. A being that could speak in the full sense, could remember, could plan, could organize, could conspire. And a labor force that could conspire was not a labor force the council was willing to have on this planet. So the workers had been given, in the original design, only the narrow range of speech that a well-trained animal could be taught. They could hear a command. They could indicate compliance. They could name a small number of objects, tools, foods, other workers, but they could not, by the design's constraint, speak in sentences that carried thought. They could not tell stories. They could not ask questions about things they had not been shown. They could not name what they did not have a word for. That was the ceiling. That was where the design stopped. Enki broke through the ceiling in a single generation. The way he did it is preserved in a text that Sumerologists have long treated as a myth about the origin of civilization, and it is that, but it is also a report of a specific act of instruction that took place in a specific place at a specific time. The place was Eridu. The time was, according to the internal chronology of the tablets, roughly 400 years after the first production run of workers from the 7 prototypes. And what Enki did was he opened his house to them. He opened the Abzu itself, or at least the upper chambers of it, to a small group of workers who had, by this point, begun to gather at the water's edge near his temple. They were the 4th generation. They were descendants of the 7th prototype, the one that had received the extra measure of his essence. And they had begun to do something the earlier generations had not done. They had begun to come to him. They did not come with any words. They came with gestures. They came in the evening, when the day's work was ended, and they sat on the bank of the marsh outside his temple, and they waited. They did not know what they were waiting for. Their bodies knew. The essence in their blood knew. They came because the resonance called them, and they sat because they did not know what else to do. And Enki, watching them from the terrace of his house, understood that they were asking for something. They did not have the word for what they were asking, so he had to give them the word first, and then let them ask for the rest. He came down from the terrace. He walked out to where they were sitting. He sat down in the mud with them, in the phrase preserved in the Eridu fragment, and he began to teach them the naming of things, not by lecture, not by command. He would pick up an object, and he would say its name in the Anunnaki tongue, and he would wait, and the workers would try to repeat it, and he would correct them until they had it, and then he would move on to the next object. He did this for a night. Then he did it for a second night. Then he did it for many nights, over many months, and slowly, the workers who came to him began to accumulate a vocabulary that was larger than any worker had ever had before. They could name the plants of the marsh. They could name the birds. They could name the parts of their own bodies. They could name the weather, the seasons, the phases of the moon. That was not the breach. Naming was, technically, still within the range of what the design permitted, though it was at the edge of the range. The breach came later, when he taught them the next thing, which was the counting of days. He taught them that the moon returned to its full shape in a fixed number of nights, and that the nights could be marked and remembered, and that a season could be predicted by the counting of moons. He taught them, in short, time. The Anunnaki concept of time, structured into cycles, recorded, anticipated. He gave them the tool that would eventually let them build calendars, plant crops on schedule, coordinate labor across generations, and, most importantly, remember what had happened to them. Because a being that can count the days can also count the losses. A being that can count the moons can also count the deaths in its family. And a being that can count the deaths can begin to ask, over time, why the deaths keep happening, and whether they need to keep happening. That was what Enlil had been afraid of when the law had been written. That was the reason the ceiling had been set where it was. And Enki broke through it. He taught them the counting, and when he taught them the counting, he broke the law of silence, and the breach was not hidden this time. The Igigi who patrolled the marshes near Eridu saw the gatherings. They saw the workers sitting in circles around Enki. They saw the workers, on later nights, sitting in circles by themselves, without Enki present, and drawing shapes in the mud that were clearly counts. Marks, numbers. They saw the workers pointing at the sky and speaking to each other in what was clearly not a labor exchange but a conversation. And the Igigi reported what they had seen to Enlil. Enlil went to the marsh himself. He watched from a distance, and what he saw confirmed the reports. The workers were speaking. Not commands, not compliance signals. They were speaking to each other in the way that Anunnaki spoke to each other, with sentences that carried memory and reference and structure. Enlil returned to the assembly hall, and he called a meeting of the council, and he brought the matter forward. And Enki was summoned, and Enki did not deny it. This is important. He could have denied it. He could have said that the workers had learned on their own. He could have said that the reports were exaggerated. he did not. He stood in the assembly hall, and when the charge was read, he said, and this phrase is preserved in the Nippur Council fragment, "I have taught them." Yes, the council was silent. Anu was in residence at that time, and Anu presided. Anu asked why. Enki said, in the phrase from the same fragment, "They came to me. I could not send them away without giving them what they asked for." And Anu, according to the tablet, was quiet for a long time before he responded. When he responded, he said only, "My son, this cost will be great." And he passed sentence. The sentence was the one the law had specified. Enki was to forfeit the me of speech for one full cycle. He was not to address the council in the assembly hall for the duration. He was not to give instruction to any Anunnaki, or to any Igigi, or to any worker in the formal setting of temple or field. He was to be silent, publicly, ceremonially, completely silent for one full cycle. A cycle, in Anunnaki reckoning, was 3,600 Earth years. That was the first visible cost. It was enormous, by the standards of any human calculation of time, and by the standards of the Anunnaki, it was still substantial. 3,600 years of silence. 3,600 years during which Enki could not speak in council, could not teach in temple, could not testify at any hearing, could not defend himself if further charges were brought. He was effectively muted. He kept his rank. He kept his me of the design. He kept his authority over the Abzu, but his voice in the affairs of the council was taken from him for a length of time that would exceed the lifespan of every civilization that would rise and fall in his absence from the record. He accepted the sentence. He walked out of the assembly hall, and he went down to the Abzu, and he did not speak in the assembly again for 3,600 years. But he did not stop teaching. This is the part of the second breach that is often missed, because it is not in the same tablet as the sentence. It is in a separate cycle, the Ninshubur cycle, which describes what Enki did during his period of formal silence. And what he did was, he continued to teach, in secret, through intermediaries. He could not address a gathering. He could not speak in public. So he chose individual workers, one at a time, from the line of the seventh prototype, and he brought them into the Abzu, and he taught them one to one, without ceremony, without record. He taught them the counting of stars. He taught them the reading of livers, which was the earliest form of Anunnaki divination. He taught them the names of the winds and the properties of the plants, and the way the rivers behaved when the mountains released their snow. He taught them, in short, everything, not all at once, not to any single one of them, but over the length of the silence. He taught them enough that when the silence ended and he was permitted to return to the assembly, the workers of Sumer already had a civilization. They had cities, they had temples, they had writing, they had law, they had astronomy, they had medicine, they had music. All of it descended, in one lineage or another, from the individual workers Enki had brought into the Abzu during his period of enforced silence. He had violated the sentence in spirit, entirely, while obeying it in letter, entirely. He had said not one word in the assembly hall for 3,600 years. He had said everything else, everywhere else, to the ones who could carry it forward. The council, when it discovered this, was furious. But by the time it discovered this, the damage was done. The workers had the knowledge. It could not be taken back. The books, or rather the tablets, were already written, and copies existed in every temple of Eridu. And the priests of Eridu were, of course, all descendants of the seventh line, and they had already begun the practice of hiding tablets in the foundations of new temples, so that even if the surface copies were destroyed, the deep copies would survive. The council could have destroyed the surface copies. The council could not have found the deep copies without demolishing every temple that had ever been built in Eridu, and that was a task the council did not have the resources to undertake. So the council did what governments do when they discover they have been outmaneuvered. It tightened the rules going forward. It added new laws to the Black Stone. It set new penalties for future breaches. And it watched Enki more closely from that point on, because it now understood, for the first time, what he was capable of doing. But it was too late. The workers had language, they had time, they had knowledge. And with those three things, they had, for the first time in their existence, the ability to be more than what the design had made them. They could ask questions, they could remember answers. They could pass what they learned from one generation to the next without needing Enki's presence in the room. That was the second law. That was the second breach. That was the second cost, which was Enki's public voice, and which was the smaller half of the actual cost. because the actual cost was something the sentence had not been able to touch. The actual cost was that Enki, during his 3,600 years of silence, could no longer speak on behalf of the workers when the council was making decisions about them. And the council, during those 3,600 years, made many decisions about them. Some of the decisions were merciful, some were not. And in the meetings where the harshest decisions were made, Enki was in the room, and he could not object. He could not raise his hand. He could not offer an alternative. He had to sit at the table and watch. And what he watched, in those centuries, was the beginning of a pattern in Enlil's administration of the workers, a pattern of increasing severity, a pattern of punishments that grew disproportionate to the offenses, a pattern that would eventually culminate in the decision to erase the workers altogether in a flood. That decision had its roots in policies that were made during Enki's period of silence. If he had been able to speak, he might have been able to alter the trajectory. He could not speak, so he could not alter it. And when the flood eventually came, and he had to break the third law to save the workers from being drowned by his own family, the reason the flood had been decided upon in the first place was, at least in part, that he had not been permitted to argue against it, when the argument might still have made a difference. That is the buried cost of the second breach. He gave the workers a voice. In exchange, he lost his own, in the one room where his voice mattered most. And by the time his voice was returned to him, the vote to destroy them had already been taken, and there was nothing left for him to do but warn one man, in secret, in the middle of the night, before the water came. There is one more part of the second breach that has to be told before we can move on to the third, because it involves a specific worker, a specific transmission, and a specific consequence that changed the shape of everything that came afterward. The worker's name, in the surviving tablet, is given as Adapa. Not the later Adapa, the one associated with the fourth breach, though the same name is used. This is an earlier man, one of the individual workers Enki brought into the Abzu during the years of silence. He was, according to the fragment, one of the last ones Enki taught personally, near the end of the sentence, when the council had begun to relax its watch, and when Enki had grown bolder about what he could risk. He taught this Adapa, the me of the seven arts, not one at a time, all at once, in a compressed transmission that took, according to the tablet, 7 nights, 1 night for each art. On the first night, he taught him the naming of things, which Adapa already knew in part, and which was completed in that first session. On the second night, he taught him the counting of days and the reading of the sky. On the third night, he taught him the shaping of clay into vessels and the writing of marks on the clay while it was still wet. On the fourth night, he taught him the properties of plants, which ones fed, which ones healed, which ones killed. On the fifth night, he taught him the tuning of strings and the striking of drums, which was the first music. On the sixth night, he taught him the reading of livers, which was the first divination. And on the seventh night, he taught him something the tablet does not name. It says only, and I am quoting the Eridu fragment, "On the seventh night Enki taught him what a man is." That is all it says. What a man is. Not what a worker is. Not what a made being is. What a man is. Adapa left the Abzu at dawn on the 8th day. He was, in the tablet's phrasing, no longer a worker in the way workers had been. He was something else. He was the first of a new kind. And he went out into the villages, and he began to do what Enki had told him to do, which was to teach the others. And Adapa was, by every account, a good teacher. He was patient, he was systematic, and within one generation of his return from the Abzu, the villages of Eridu had specialists: potters, musicians, scribes, priests, healers, diviners, the full apparatus of what would eventually become the first city. Enlil, when he saw what Adapa was doing, did not immediately move against him. He waited. He wanted to see how far it would go. And when it had gone far enough, he brought Adapa before the council. This is the trial scene that appears in the later Adapa myth, though the later myth has been reworked so many times that it is hard to see the original shape underneath. The original shape was a trial. Adapa was accused of teaching workers things a worker was not supposed to know. Adapa did not deny it, and Adapa was asked, in the same fragment, who had taught him. He named Enki. Enki was still in his period of silence. He could not defend Adapa. He could not defend himself. He sat at the council table and listened while Adapa was interrogated, and he watched while the council decided what to do with him. The council could not execute Adapa, because Adapa had not, technically, done anything Adapa was not permitted to do. He had taught what he had been taught. The workers had a right to receive teaching from their own kind, and Adapa was, technically still a worker. The law of silence applied to Anunnaki teaching workers. It did not apply, in its written form, to workers teaching workers. This was a loophole the council had not anticipated, and it was a loophole Enki had spotted, and it was the whole reason he had taught Adapa in the first place. He had made a teacher who was not himself. He had made a way for the knowledge to keep spreading without any further violation of the law by any Anunnaki. The council was stuck. It could not punish Adapa for what he had done, because he had not broken any law. It could add a new law, which is what it eventually did, but it could not apply the new law retroactively. So the council did the only thing left to it. It changed the terms of Adapa's life. It made him, in the phrasing of the tablet, more than a worker, but less than a member. It gave him certain privileges, longer life, freedom of movement between cities, the right to hold property. And it took certain things from him too. It removed him from the fields, so that he could no longer teach workers who were still working. It confined him to Eridu, and it made him report, once every cycle, to the council, so that the council could monitor what he was passing on to whom. Adapa accepted the terms. He had no choice. And for the rest of his considerably extended life, he lived in Eridu, and he continued to teach, but only to the ones who came to him in the temple, only in the forms the council permitted, only under the observation of Enlil's officers. And Enki watched all of this in silence. He could not say anything. He could not intervene. But he had already done what he had come to do. Adapa had been made. The teaching had been transmitted. And the workers, from that generation forward, would have the arts. Not all of them, not evenly distributed, but enough that the seed was planted, and enough that no policy of the council, however severe, could pull the seed back out of the ground. That was the second breach. That was its cost. Both the visible cost of 3,600 years of ceremonial silence and the deeper cost of not being able to defend either the workers or the man he had taught when the moment came. Enki paid the cost. Adapa paid a cost too, and paid it for the rest of his life. And the workers, who did not know what had been paid on their behalf, went on with their new arts and their new counting of days. And they built their first proper cities, and they made their first proper temples, and they wrote their first proper tablets. And every one of those developments came from the teaching Enki had given, in secret, during the years when he was not permitted to speak. That is the second layer of the second breach, which is often missed. Every good thing that comes to us from Sumerian civilization, every gift of language and time and craft and music, is downstream of the moment. Enki broke the law of silence in the marsh outside his temple. And every moment of watching, of not being able to intervene, of sitting in the assembly hall while decisions were being made that he could not oppose, was the price he paid for making that gift. He was not silent inside himself. He was only silent in the room where silence had been imposed. And when the sentence ended, and he was permitted to speak in council again, the first thing he did was start preparing for the next breach. Because the flood was already being planned. The vote had not been taken yet, but the arguments were being made. And Enki, who could now speak but who could not yet vote against a decision that had not yet been proposed, had begun to work out, in his own mind, what he would do if the flood was approved. He would need a man, he would need a boat, he would need a warning. And the warning would have to be given in a way that did not violate the letter of any law the council might pass in advance to prevent it. He had been preparing this for a long time already. Before the sentence ended, he had chosen the man. The man's name was Zeusudra, and the third law was already being drafted, in Enlil's own hand, to make sure that the warning could not be given. That is where the third breach begins, in the drafting of a law designed to prevent the very thing Enki had already decided he would do. The third law was the law of the ending. Its full text on the black stone, as reconstructed from the Nippur assembly fragments, read as follows. When the council has decided that a made being is to be ended, no member shall inform the made being of the decision. No member shall reveal, by word or by sign or by written mark, the manner or the time or the reason of the ending. The made being shall not know that it is to be ended, and shall not be permitted to prepare for the ending, and shall not be permitted to escape the ending. Any member found to have given warning shall forfeit the me of the deep waters, and shall have his authority over the Abzu diminished by one channel for each mortal warned. That was the law. And unlike the first two, this one had a specific occasion behind its drafting. Enlil had proposed it himself, and he had proposed it in the same council session where the flood was first discussed as a possibility. The flood was not yet decided at that point. The proposal was still being debated, but Enlil, who had been observing the workers for the 1,500 years since Enki's period of silence had ended, had concluded that the workers had become a problem the council could not solve by any lesser means. They were multiplying too fast. They were spreading beyond the regions the council had assigned them. They were building on land the council had reserved for the Anunnaki themselves. And most importantly, they were making so much noise, day and night, in their growing cities, that the Anunnaki could not sleep. That last complaint, which sounds absurd to modern ears, is preserved in the Atrahasis in exactly those words. The clamor of the earth dwellers had grown so great that the gods could not rest. Enlil proposed, therefore, that the workers be reduced. Not exterminated, reduced. He proposed a plague. Enki opposed it. He argued in the assembly hall, using his voice for the first time since his sentence had ended, and he argued that a plague would be indiscriminate, that it would kill the useful workers along with the useless, and that a better solution would be to relocate the workers to regions where their clamor would not disturb the Anunnaki quarters. Enki's argument won. The plague was not sent, but Enlil, in the same session, proposed a supplementary measure. He proposed the drafting of a new law, a preemptive law, a law that would apply to any future decision the council might make about the workers, and that law was the law of the ending. He proposed it because he had seen, in Enki's opposition to the plague, that Enki would continue to protect the workers, and he wanted to make sure that no future protection could take the form of a warning. The council approved the law. It was carved on the black stone, and Enki, watching the carving, understood that the law had been aimed at him specifically. He said nothing at the time. He accepted the law, and he began, from that day forward, to prepare his violation of it. He had, at that point, already chosen the man. The man was Ziusudra, of Shurapak. He was a king, not by the Anunnaki appointment, but by the acclaim of his own people, which meant, in the workers' system of governance that had developed since Adapa, that he had been raised to the office by the elders of his city, who saw in him the qualities they wanted in a leader. He was pious. He kept the shrines. He made the offerings at the times the priests had specified, and he was, importantly, a descendant of the seventh line. The essence in his blood was concentrated, more so than in most of his contemporaries. Enki had watched him for many years, and had made small contacts with him over that time. Not enough to draw attention, but enough that when the warning came, Ziusudra would recognize the source and act on it immediately, without hesitation. The flood was decided upon roughly 100 years after the law of the ending was carved. The decision came in a council session that Enki attended, and at which he argued, and at which he lost. Enlil made his case. The workers had continued to multiply. They had continued to spread. Their clamor had grown, if anything, worse. And this time Enlil proposed not a plague, but a total ending. Every worker on the earth would be destroyed. The rains would come from the sky, and the springs would open from the ground, and the water would cover the plain for as long as it took to drown every last one of them, and then the water would recede, and the earth would be clean, and the council could start again, with a new design, made properly this time, without whatever Enki had done to the last one. That was Enlil's proposal. Enki fought it. He fought it for 6 days in the assembly hall. He proposed alternatives. He proposed relocations. He proposed sterilizations. He proposed selective removals. He proposed everything he could think of that would preserve at least some of the workers. Every proposal was voted down. And on the 7th day, the flood was approved, by a majority that included every senior member of the council except Enki himself and, notably, Ninhursag. Ninhursag voted against it too. She stood with her brother, publicly, for the first time. And the vote passed anyway. Because they were two, and the council was many, the flood was to begin in one cycle. That was the timing set. One cycle, in the shorter Anunnaki reckoning used for planning purposes, was 600 Earth years. That was the window. In 600 years, the rains would come. Until then, no member of the council was to speak of the decision to any worker. That was the law. And any member who did was to forfeit channels of the Abzu, one channel per mortal warned. Enki left the assembly hall and went down into the Abzu, and he sat on the floor of his own house, and he thought for a long time. He thought about the man he had chosen. He thought about the law he was about to break. He thought about the cost, which the Black Stone had already written, which he had read many times, and which he knew he was going to pay. And he thought about the specific way he would deliver the warning, because the law had been written carefully. It said that no member shall inform. It said that no member shall reveal by word, by sign, or by written mark. Enki, whose specialty was the finding of loopholes, went through the language of the law, line by line, and he found the loophole he needed. It was a small one, but it was enough. The law said no member shall inform the made being. It did not say no member shall speak in the presence of a wall. And walls, in the Abzu, were not made beings. He waited until the last cycle before the flood. He waited until the timing was such that Ziusudra would have exactly the time he needed, no more and no less, to build what he would need to build. And then, on a night when Ziusudra was making his customary offering at the shrine of Enki and Shuruppak, Enki did the thing that broke the third law. He did not speak to Ziusudra. He spoke to the wall of the shrine, in the presence of Ziusudra, in a voice that was pitched low, as if he were reciting to himself. He said, and this speech is preserved almost intact in the Atrahasis and in the Berosus reconstruction, wall of my house, wall of the shrine of my hand, hear what I say, the rains are coming, the rains will not stop. Every place where the worker stands will be underwater in one cycle from this night. The one who would live must build. He must build a vessel. He must build it of reeds coated with pitch. He must build it in the measure of 6 by 60 by 6. He must bring into it 2 of every kind. He must bring into it his own family. He must seal the door with pitch when the first drop falls. And he must not open the door until the water has receded. Hear me, wall. This is what I say. Then he left. He did not look at Ziusudra. He did not acknowledge that Ziusudra was there. He walked out of the shrine, and he went back down into the Abzu, and he sat on the floor of his house and waited to see what Ziusudra would do. Ziusudra had heard. He had heard every word. He was, by design, one of the workers with the most concentrated essence, and his understanding was quick, and his obedience to the source of the essence was almost total. He went home that night. He did not tell his wife what he had heard. He did not tell the elders. He began, the next morning, to gather reeds. He began to gather pitch. He began to buy timber, discreetly, in small amounts, from different suppliers in different cities, so that no one supplier would notice the accumulation. He began to build, in a workshop outside the city, a structure whose shape did not match any known kind of building, and which he covered with cloth when he was not working on it, and which he permitted no one to see until it was finished. It took him most of the 600 years, in the tablet's telling, though the 600 years is likely a compression of a shorter period, because Ziusudra was a mortal and his lifespan was not that long, even with the extra measure of essence in his blood. Whatever the actual timing, he built. He built the vessel, he gathered the animals, one pair at a time, from all the corners of the land, and he housed them, and he fed them, and he prepared their fodder for the long confinement. He gathered his family, and on the day the rains came, he sealed the door of the vessel with pitch, and he did not open it again until the water had receded. The flood was as complete as Enlil had promised. Every worker on the plain was drowned. Every city was submerged. Every temple was buried under a layer of silt that would still be visible to archaeologists thousands of years later. Only Ziusudra and his family survived, and the animals with them. And when the water finally receded and Ziusudra opened the door of the vessel, he stepped out onto a plain that was empty of every other human being he had ever known. And he made an offering. He built an altar out of the mud that was still wet on the ground, and he burned a portion of the meat of one of the animals, and the smoke went up into the sky, and the smell of it reached the Anunnaki, who had been hiding in their own vessels during the flood, watching from a distance. They came down to the altar. Enlil came, Anu came, Ninhursag came, Enki came, and they smelled the offering, and they saw Ziusudra standing at the altar with his family, and Enlil understood immediately what had happened. He turned to Enki in front of the whole council, and he said, in the phrase preserved in the Berosus account, "Brother, no one escapes without your hand." Enki did not deny it. He said, in the same fragment, "I spoke to a wall." That was his defense. He had, technically, not broken the letter of the law. He had not informed the made being. He had spoken in the being's presence. He had spoken to the wall. Enlil rejected the defense. The council convened immediately at the site of the altar, and it deliberated for what the tablet says was 1 day and 1 night, and at the end of the deliberation, it delivered the sentence. Enki had violated the law of the ending. The consequence was clear. The me of the deep waters was to be diminished. His authority over the Abzu was to be reduced by 1 channel for each mortal warned. Ziusudra was 1 mortal, but Ziusudra's family was 6 more. That was 7. And the animals, in the interpretation the council chose, were also his responsibility, and the animals numbered, according to the tablet's count, 94 pairs, which was 188 individual beings. The council reduced Enki's authority over the Abzu by 195 channels, It was more than half of what he held. The Abzu, which had been his by right of his office as keeper of the deep waters, was now his by right of only a fraction of that office. The other channels were reassigned. Some went to Enlil, some went to Nergal of the underworld. Some were left unassigned, to be held in trust by the council itself. Enki lost the majority of his own house that day. He kept enough that he could still live in it, still work in it, still make the meetings that his position required him to make. But he could no longer command the waters the way he once had. He could no longer draw on the full depth of the Abzu when he needed to. And he could no longer, in a very real operational sense, control the environment that had been his to control since the expedition first arrived. That was the third cost. It was the largest cost so far. And it was the first cost that was fully visible to the workers, because Ziusudra himself, who lived a long time after the flood and who told his descendants what had happened, told them also what Enki had lost on their behalf. It was Ziusudra who first made public, in the temples of the resettled cities, the fact that Enki had paid for the survival of the human race with a portion of his own authority. It was Ziusudra who first taught the offering that would become the standard offering to Enki throughout Sumer, a portion of water poured into the earth, in memory of the channels of the Abzu that had been taken from him. Every temple to Enki, in the ancient Near East, from the 2nd millennium onward, had at its entrance a channel cut into the floor, into which water was poured at every service, and the water sank into the ground and vanished, and no one was supposed to know why. The channel was the memorial, the vanishing was the cost. Enki had lost a portion of his depth, and the workers, who owed him their existence, marked the loss with water forever. But even that was not the whole of the third cost, because Enki had done something else in the giving of the warning that the council had not yet noticed, and that would eventually be counted against him too. He had spoken in the presence of the wall, but the wall was not empty. The wall was the wall of a shrine, and shrines have their own resonance, and the shrine of Enki had been built by workers who carried his essence, and the walls of the shrine, over the many years the shrine had stood, had absorbed a portion of that essence themselves. When Enki spoke to the wall did not just convey his words to Ziusudra, the wall recorded them. The shrine kept, in the substance of its stone, a copy of what he had said, and that copy would, thousands of years later, be recovered by a specific line of priests who would understand what it was, and who would use it to reconstruct the 4th law, and the 5th, and the 6th, and to know, before anyone else knew, what Enki had done. That was the buried piece of the third cost. He had not just warned Ziusudra, he had, without meaning to, recorded his own violation in a form that could not be erased. And when the black stone itself was eventually broken, and the assembly hall at Nippur was eventually abandoned, and every other record of his breaches was scattered or destroyed, the walls of the shrine at Shurapak still held what he had said that night. That is why we have the words at all. That is why we know exactly what he did. The rain had stopped. The water had receded. Ziusudra had made his offering. And Enki, standing at the altar with his diminished authority and his lost channels and his exposed hand, understood that he was now, formally, a member of the council who had been caught breaking the law. He was no longer just under suspicion. He was under sentence. And the next breach he committed would be committed as a known offender. There would be no benefit of the doubt. There would be no assumption of good intent. There would be only the accounting, growing longer with each violation, until the accounting reached a threshold the council had not yet defined, but which everyone at the altar that day understood was coming. Enki understood it too. And he made a decision, at the altar, that would shape the next 5 breaches. He decided that if he was going to keep breaking the laws, he might as well break the ones that mattered most. He decided he was going to accelerate. The cost would come faster. The losses would come larger, but so would the gifts. And the workers, whom he had just saved from the flood, would receive, over the next several thousand years, the full inheritance he had been holding back until now. The 4th breach was already forming in his mind as he walked away from the altar. It was the largest one yet. It was the one that would give the workers, formally and officially and permanently, a portion of the Anunnaki bloodline that could not be denied. And the man who would receive it, in the tablet's telling, was named Adapa. Not the same Adapa as before. A new one. A different one. A descendant, several generations down, of the same 7th line. And what Enki would do to him would change the meaning of what a human being was, and would cost Enki something that the 3rd breach had not yet cost him, which was his son. Before we move to the 4th breach, stop for a second. What you just heard about the flood only makes sense on the full timeline, next to the 6 resets before it. Every reset wiped one design from the Earth. The 8th is loading now. It is all in the 7 resets, linked below. QR code is on your screen. The 4th law was the law of the blood. Its full text on the black stone read as follows in the Nippur reconstruction. No member of the council shall transfer to a made being the substance of the bread of life or the substance of the water of life. No member shall permit a made being to consume these substances, whether by intent or by accident, in any temple or in any private chamber, or in any place under the jurisdiction of the council. The bread of life and the water of life are the property of the council alone. Any member who transfers these substances shall forfeit his role as father, and shall be removed from the succession, and shall not name any of his descendants as heirs of his office for the remainder of his existence. That was the law, and to understand what it meant, and what Enki did to break it, we have to understand what the bread of life and the water of life actually were, because on this point almost every later retelling gets it wrong. The bread of life was not bread, it was a compound. The tablets describe it as a preparation made in the private kitchens of Anu himself, from ingredients that were not native to the earth but had been brought down in the ships of the expedition, and that could not be replicated with earth-native materials. The compound had a specific effect on the body of an Anunnaki, and, by extension, on any body that carried enough Anunnaki blood to react to it. The effect was longevity. The Anunnaki, whose lifespans were measured in tens of thousands of years even without the compound, consumed a small portion of the bread of life at their council meetings, and the consumption extended their lives by a factor that the tablets do not quantify but that appears to have been considerable. The water of life was a companion substance, a liquid, which worked in combination with the bread. Together, the two substances kept the members of the council alive across the immense spans of time that Anunnaki governance required. A worker who consumed these substances would not immediately become an Anunnaki, but a worker who consumed them, and who carried enough of Enki's essence in their blood to react to the substances properly, would live longer, much longer, not thousands of years, but hundreds. And a lineage descended from such a worker would carry, in a diluted form, the capacity to react to those substances if the substances were ever provided again. That is what the law was designed to prevent. Not just the immediate longevity of one worker, but the establishment of a lineage among the workers that could receive the substances and use them. Enki had, by the time of the 4th breach, been thinking about this problem for a long time. The flood had killed most of the workers. Ziusudra's family had survived and had begun to repopulate the plain, and the population was growing again, but the population was also aging faster than Enki thought was appropriate for creatures that carried his essence in their blood. The Anunnaki had made the workers with a limited lifespan on purpose, 60 years, 70 at the outside. That was the maximum. And when a worker died at 70, the essence in their body decayed with the body, and the accumulated wisdom of that worker's lifetime was lost. Enki had watched this happen enough times, in enough workers, that he had come to see it as a waste of his own contribution to their making. Every worker who died young was a portion of his essence being buried in the ground. He wanted, if he could arrange it, to have at least some of the workers live long enough that the accumulated wisdom could be passed on properly, could accumulate across a lifetime the way it did in the Anunnaki, could produce, over enough time, the kind of deep understanding that the shorter lifespans made impossible. He selected a man. The man was Adapa of Eridu, distinct from the Adapa of the 2nd breach, though the name was the same because the name was traditional in the priestly line of the 7th prototype and had been passed down from father to son for many generations. This Adapa was a priest at the temple of Enki in Eridu. He was, according to the tablet, the son of Enki's most trusted human intermediary, a man named Yuan, who had served as the chief priest of the temple for his entire adult life, and who had been personally instructed by Enki during the years of formal silence, though this instruction had been kept quiet enough that the council had never brought a case against Yuan the way it had brought one against the first Adapa. Yuan had died at 90, which was extreme old age for a worker of his generation, and his son Adapa had inherited the priesthood, and Enki had watched him grow up and had judged him, correctly or not, to be the right vessel for the 4th transmission. Adapa was, in the tablet's phrasing, a fisherman of the deep waters. This is not a metaphor. He fished in the marsh, and he brought his catch to the temple, and he cooked it, and he ate a portion himself and gave the rest to the other priests. This was his daily practice. And one day, when he was out in his boat on the marsh, a wind came up from the south and capsized him. He was thrown into the water, and he swam back to his boat, and he cursed the wind. The tablet is careful about this detail. He cursed the wind by name. He said, "May your wing be broken." And in the Anunnaki system, a curse from a made being who carried the essence of a council member could, under specific conditions, actually damage the thing being cursed. The wind was, in this case, one of the 7 winds of heaven, which were governed by the office of Anu directly. Adapa had, by cursing it, broken its wing. The south wind stopped blowing. For 7 days, no wind came from the south. And the fishermen and the sailors and the farmers all noticed, and it made its way, through channels, up to the council, and Anu himself demanded an explanation. Enki was informed of the summons before Adapa was. This is the critical detail. Enki knew, before Adapa did, that Adapa was going to be called up to the assembly hall at Nippur to answer for what he had done. And Enki knew what Anu would do. Anu would test him. Anu would offer him something, and whatever Anu offered him, Adapa would have to refuse. Because if he accepted it, he would die, because a made being who accepted anything from Anu without permission was to be, by council law, terminated on the spot. Enki understood this, and Enki decided to use it. He summoned Adapa to the temple in Eridu, and he prepared him for the trip. He gave him instructions. When you go up before Anu, he said, you must wear mourning clothes. You must weep as you enter. When Anu asks why you are weeping, you must say that 2 of the great gods have vanished from the earth, and that you mourn for them. Anu will ask which 2. You must say Tammuz and Gazida, and when Anu hears this, he will be pleased that you honor his court, and he will offer you food and drink. When he offers you food, you must refuse it. When he offers you drink, you must refuse it. When he offers you clothing, you may accept it. When he offers you oil, you may accept it. But the food and drink you must refuse, because they will be poisoned, and they will kill you. That was the instruction. That was what Enki told Adapa. And Adapa believed him, because Enki was the god of his temple and the god of his line, and there was no reason not to believe him. And Adapa went up to the assembly hall at Nippur, dressed in mourning, weeping as he entered, and he did everything Enki had told him to do. He named Tammuz and Gazida. Anu was, indeed, pleased. And Anu offered him food and drink. But Enki had lied to him. And this is the part of the 4th breach that is often missed, because the surface of the tablet reads as if Enki had made a mistake, and later scholars have often interpreted it as a tragic error, as Enki tricking his own protege by accident. That reading is wrong. It was not a mistake. Enki knew exactly what Anu was going to offer. The food and drink that Anu was going to offer Adapa were not poison. They were the bread of life and the water of life. Anu offered them because he was, in his way, testing to see whether Enki had already prepared this worker to receive them. If Adapa accepted, Adapa would live for a very long time. If Adapa refused, the council would understand that Enki had not yet made this move, and the council would relax. Anu wanted to know, and Enki, who had understood the test, chose to have Adapa refuse, not because he did not want Adapa to live long, but because he did not want the council to know, yet, that Adapa was capable of receiving the substances at all. The refusal was the diversion. It was the same tactic Enki had used with the 7th vessel and the extra measure of essence. He was hiding the operational fact behind a public appearance of compliance. And it worked. Anu, when Adapa refused, laughed. He laughed. According to the tablet, in the specific manner of a father whose son has just failed a test that no one told the son was a test. He laughed at Adapa, and he sent him back to the earth. And on the way back to the earth, Anu gave Adapa a small gift, a token of consolation for having failed the test. The gift was a fragment of the compound, a small portion, not the full ration, not the ceremonial serving, but enough that if Adapa consumed it, alone, in the privacy of his own temple, he would live longer than any worker had ever lived before. Anu did not know he was giving this, or perhaps he did know, and he was making his own decision about Enki's plan without telling the rest of the council. The tablet is ambiguous, but the fragment was given, and Adapa took it home. And Enki, when he saw what Adapa had brought back, understood that the gift was the real answer to the test. Anu had known, and Anu had decided, in his own way, without a council vote, to permit the transmission after all. Perhaps because Anu was tired, perhaps because Anu was old and could see, from his position at the top of the hierarchy, that the workers were going to receive the substances eventually one way or another, and that it might as well happen under his own supervision than under someone else's. Whatever the reason, the gift was given. And Enki, who had been prepared to break the fourth law by whatever means necessary, was given a way to break it that would not, technically, count as a violation, because the substance had come from Anu himself, not from Enki. Or so it seemed. But when the council convened the next day, and the details of the visit were reported to Enlil, Enlil was not fooled. He understood what had happened. He understood that Anu, whether by design or by fatigue, had done what Enki had wanted, and that the operational result was the same as if Enki had transferred the substance directly. Enlil brought charges. He brought them not against Anu, because Anu was above the council's authority, but against Enki, because Enki had orchestrated the situation. He argued in the assembly hall, and he argued for many days, and the council eventually agreed with him. Enki had, by manipulating the conditions of Adapa's visit, affected the transfer of the bread of life and the water of life to a made being. He had done it indirectly. But he had done it, and the law, when it had been carved on the black stone, had not specified direct or indirect. The transfer was the transfer. The consequence was applied. Enki forfeited his role as father. He was removed from the succession. His descendants would not inherit his office. His son, Marduk, who had until that day been the presumptive next holder of the me of the design, was moved down the list of heirs. Not to the bottom, but down. And Marduk, when he was told, was furious. He was furious at his father for making a decision that had cost him his inheritance. He was furious at Enlil for pressing the charge. And he was furious at the council for accepting it. And Marduk, from that day forward, began to plan his own path to power that would not depend on his father's diminishing position. This is the buried cost of the fourth breach that most retellings miss. Enki did not just lose the succession, he lost his son. Not through death, Marduk did not die, but he stopped being the son Enki had raised. He became something colder. He became more like Enlil in temperament, in method, in his tolerance for the workers. And over the centuries that followed, Marduk would grow into a figure who, in the last age of Sumer, would eventually be worshipped as the chief god of Babylon, and who would, in the Enuma Elish, be depicted as the killer of the primordial mother Tiamat and the maker of the world in its current form. The Marduk of the Enuma Elish is a different figure from the Marduk of Enki's early paternity. He is harder, he is more transactional, he is less sympathetic to the workers, though he does not oppose them the way Enlil did. He simply does not, in his heart, feel them as his father did. And that difference of feeling, according to the tablets, dates from the day when Enki lost the succession, and Marduk understood that his own future had been sacrificed for the survival of a species that Marduk himself did not particularly love. Adapa, meanwhile, took the fragment of the substance home. He consumed it in the privacy of his temple, alone, without ceremony, and he lived, according to the tablet, for 330 years. 330, which is a number that appears notably in other places in the ancient record, and which corresponds closely to the recorded lifespans of the patriarchs in the biblical account, whose story is a compressed and reattributed version of the same lineage. Adapa lived long, he taught long, he passed on to his descendants the seed of what he had received, and those descendants, whose blood carried the residue of the compound, lived longer than the workers around them, and formed, over time, the priestly caste that would sustain the temples of Enki through every subsequent age. That is the fourth breach in its long form. And the cost was Enki's son, not in death, in estrangement, and in the long, slow shift of Marduk from a father's heir to a father's stranger, which was the cost that no one at the assembly hall on the day of the sentencing was yet able to see, but which would become, over the next several thousand years, the shape of the family that Enki had once had and which he had, one law at a time, been giving up. There is one further element of the fourth breach that must be laid out before we go on, because it explains what happens later in the arc, when the eighth breach comes into view. The element is this: when Anu handed the fragment of the compound to Adapa, and when Adapa took it home and consumed it, and lived his 330 years, the residue of the compound did not leave the earth when Adapa died. It stayed. It stayed in his line, in the tissues of his descendants, in the marrow of their bones and the fluid of their brains, and it produced, over the generations, a specific and traceable trait. The trait was longevity, yes, but only in the earliest generations, and only in a partial form. The trait that persisted for much longer, and which is still present in the surviving lineages of that priestly caste, is something else. It is a kind of hearing. a capacity to hear voices that the surrounding population does not hear. To hear, in particular, the voice of Enki, when he speaks in the manner he used to speak to walls. Every prophet in the ancient Near East, every seer, every mystic who reported hearing a voice that told them what to do or what to say, was, according to the tradition preserved in the priestly line of Eridu, hearing a variant of that voice. The mechanism was the residue of the compound in their blood. It made them, in a way that could not be undone and could not be inherited except through the priestly line, receivers. And Enki, from that moment forward, had a way to speak to specific human beings across the generations, without breaking any further council law, because he was not speaking to them directly. He was speaking, as always, to the room. And the compound in their blood was the antenna that pulled his words down out of the room and into their ears. This is the piece of the story that connects Enki to every subsequent religious tradition. Not because he founded those traditions, he did not. Most of them arose without any awareness of who he was or what he had done, but because the mechanism he installed in the priestly line, through the compound Anu gave to Adapa, kept working. It is still working. Every person who, in the modern world, feels certain that they are hearing an inner voice that comes from outside their own thinking is, in the tradition of Eridu, running on a piece of hardware that Enki installed by breaking the fourth law, which is why the priesthood of Eridu, long after the temples had fallen, has continued to maintain that Enki is not gone. He is not dead. He is speaking. He has been speaking, without interruption, from the day he lost the succession to this day, into the ears of the descendants of the man he prepared for that visit to Anu. And they have been transcribing what they hear, in whatever language they had available, and calling it prophecy, or revelation, or inspiration, depending on the century. The cost of the fourth breach, in the fullest accounting, was Enki's son, and Enki's succession, and Enki's official position in the council. What he gained was a channel of communication that no council law could shut off, and which he has used ever since. That is why the tablets refer to him, in the later cycles, as the whispering one. Not the shouting one, not the speaking one, the whispering one, because he has been whispering to the priestly line since the day Adapa consumed the fragment, and the whispering has not stopped. And the eighth breach, when it comes, will happen because the whispering is about to become audible to the whole earth, and not only to the priestly line. That is what the eighth breach is. But we are not there yet. We have 4 more laws to walk through first. The fifth is the one where Enki gave the workers the knowledge of the arts they were not supposed to have, not the arts he had already given Adapa in the second breach. Different arts, deeper arts. The arts of metal, and of medicine, and of the strong drink that lets a person see what they cannot see when they are sober. And the cost of that breach was the loss of one of his own cities, which is where we go next. The fifth law was the law of the arts. Its full text on the black stone read as follows in the reconstruction. No member of the council shall teach a made being the working of metal, whether copper, whether tin, whether bronze, whether iron. No member shall teach a made being the compounding of medicine beyond the level of the simple plant preparation. No member shall teach a made being the making of the strong drink, or the making of the smoke that changes sight, or the making of any substance that alters the mind of the one who consumes it. These arts are the property of the council alone. The made being shall grow food, and shall shape clay, and shall build in mud and reed, and shall do no more. Any member found to have taught these arts shall forfeit his city, and shall not hold a temple of the first rank for the remainder of his existence. That was the law. And it was, at the time it was carved, the most explicit and the most narrowly targeted of all the laws on the black stone, because it was written after Enki had already begun to test the boundaries in a way the council could see. The workers, in the centuries following the flood, had developed rapidly. They had, through the teaching of Adapa's line and through the priestly caste that had descended from the first prototypes, acquired the basic arts of civilization. They could farm, they could build in mud brick, they could write, they could count, but they could not work metal. That, so far, was the ceiling. And Enlil, watching the pace of their development, had proposed the fifth law specifically to prevent that ceiling from being broken. Because metal, in Enlil's judgment, was the point of no return. A worker who could work bronze could make a sword. A worker who could make a sword could resist an Anunnaki. And a worker who could resist an Anunnaki was no longer, in any meaningful sense, a worker. The law passed by a narrow vote. Enki and Ninhursag both voted against it, but they were joined by only 2 other members, and the majority carried. The law was carved, and Enki, walking out of the assembly hall on the day of the carving, understood that he was going to have to break it, because he had already promised the arts to the priestly line of Eridu, and he was not a member who broke promises to those he had made. The way he broke it is one of the most detailed accounts in the entire tablet corpus, because unlike the earlier breaches, this one required him to establish a physical infrastructure that the council would eventually discover, and the discovery, when it came, was documented at length by the officers who conducted it. What Enki did was he chose a specific city in a specific location, and he established there a set of workshops that were, on the surface, ordinary craftsmen's workshops of the kind that had already been permitted by the council. On the surface, underneath, in chambers dug into the ground beneath the workshops, he established a second set of workshops, which the officers who eventually found them called the deep forges. And in those deep forges he taught, personally, over a period the tablets estimate as 300 years, a small group of workers the full range of the forbidden arts. The city he chose was Kish. This is important because Kish had, until this point, been an ordinary city under the general jurisdiction of the council. Enki had no special claim on Kish. His own city was Eridu, but Kish was distant enough from the assembly hall at Nippur that the council did not routinely inspect it, and it was close enough to the mountain passes that led to the northern regions where copper and tin could be found in the ground. Enki set up his workshops in Kish precisely because Kish was, in the political geography of the expedition, a blind spot, and for 300 years, the council did not see what he was doing there. The workers he taught were, again, drawn from the priestly line of Eridu, but they were not the priests themselves. They were the lay members of the line, the ones who did not serve in the temple, the ones whose blood carried the essence but who worked at ordinary trades. Enki brought them to Kish, one at a time, on the pretext that they were being trained as agricultural specialists for a project he was running in the northern fields. This pretext was thin. Enlil, if he had inspected the records, would have seen that the number of specialists being trained was far greater than any northern project could require. But Enlil, at that time, was distracted by a dispute with Ninurta over territory in the eastern mountains, and he did not look at the records. And Enki knew he would not look. In the deep forges, Enki taught the workers to smelt copper. He taught them to combine copper with tin to make bronze, and he taught them the temperature curves that made bronze hard rather than brittle. He taught them to work the bronze into blades, into helmets, into armor. He taught them, separately, to smelt iron, which was a harder art and which he did not yet expect them to master, but which he introduced them to, so that the seed of it would be present in the workshops when a later generation was ready. He taught them, in a separate chamber, the compounding of medicines. Not the simple plant preparations that the law permitted, but the compound preparations, the ones that combine multiple plants in specific ratios and specific sequences to produce effects that the plants alone could not produce. He taught them how to reduce fever, how to slow bleeding, how to accelerate healing, how to end pregnancy if a pregnancy needed to be ended, how to preserve a body against decomposition, how to soften pain in the dying. He taught them the making of the strong drink, which the tablets call the drink of the 7 grains, and which was the earliest form of what would later become beer, and which had, when consumed in the correct ratio, an effect on the mind that let the drinker perceive things they could not perceive when sober. He taught them the burning of the resins that produced the same effect through smoke, and he taught them all of this in the deep forges of Kish, under the ground, in secret, for 300 years. The council found out through an accident. One of the workers he had trained, a smith named Enki, went home to visit his family in Eridu, and he brought with him, as gifts, small bronze objects that he had made himself. Rings, small knives, a cup. His family did not understand what they were looking at. They had seen bronze before, because the Anunnaki themselves used bronze objects, but they had never seen bronze objects that had been made by a worker. And one of Enki's cousins, who was a servant in a house that was frequented by an Anunnaki official of the middle rank, showed the cup to that official, thinking the official would be interested in the craftsmanship. The official was interested. The official was interested in a way the cousin had not anticipated. He took the cup. He asked where it had come from. Enki was named. And within a cycle, the officers of Enlil were at the deep forges of Kish, and they had opened them, and they had found what was inside. What they found was extensive. Hundreds of workers, full smelting operations, bronze weapons stockpiled in a chamber that could have equipped an army, medicines that the officers, when they took samples back to the assembly hall, were not able to identify, vats of the strong drink, burners for the resins, diagrams on the walls, In a script the workers had developed themselves, showing the temperature curves and the ratios and the sequences that Enki had taught them. It was, in the language of a later era, a full technology transfer. And the officers, when they reported to Enlil, did not know how to describe the scale of what they had found, because nothing on that scale had ever been discovered before. Enlil convened the council. The evidence was displayed in the assembly hall. Enki was called to answer. And Enki, for the second time in his existence, did not deny it. He said, in the phrase preserved in the Kish council fragment, "They came to me for the arts. I could not refuse them." The council deliberated. And the sentence, when it was passed, was the one the law had specified. Enki forfeited his city. But because his city, in the formal sense, was Eridu and not Kish, the council had to make a determination about which city he actually forfeited. And the determination was that he had forfeited Eridu. The reasoning was that Eridu had been the source. The priestly line was based in Eridu. The workers who had gone to Kish had been recruited from Eridu, and therefore Eridu, as the seat of the operation, was what had to be taken from him. Kish, which had been the site of the workshops, was permitted to remain in his indirect influence, because Kish had no special connection to his office, and could not be assigned to anyone else without a formal reorganization. Enki lost Eridu. This was, in the operational sense of the expedition, the largest loss he had suffered so far. Eridu was not just a city, it was his temple. It was the seat of his priesthood. It was the site where the walls had absorbed his voice when he had warned Ziusudra. It was the place where every member of the priestly line came to make their offerings, where the me of the design was stored, where the deepest of his records were kept. And it was now, by council order, transferred to the joint administration of Enlil and Nergal. Enki was permitted to visit. He was not permitted to reside. He was not permitted to conduct services. And the priests of Eridu, who had served him for many generations, were required to serve, from that day forward, under the direction of Enlil's officers. The cost was enormous, but like the other costs, it had a hidden layer. The hidden layer was that the priests of Eridu, when they were placed under Enlil's direction, did not stop serving Enki in their hearts. They served Enlil in their outward practice, because they had no choice. But they continued to serve Enki in secret, in the smaller shrines that Enlil did not know about, in the underground chambers of their houses, in the offerings they made at the marsh when the moon was dark. The priesthood, in effect, went underground. And this had a consequence Enlil had not anticipated. It meant that the priestly line, which had until that point been a public institution with public records, became a secret institution with private records. And private records survive differently than public records survive. When the temples of Eridu were eventually destroyed, first by the raids of the mountain peoples and then by the collapse of the Sumerian civilization and finally by the sands that buried what was left, the public records of Eridu were largely lost. The private records of the priesthood, however, which had been hidden in the foundations of the smaller shrines and in the underground chambers of the houses, survived. They were passed from one generation to the next, in fragments, in copies, in reproductions, and they contain, according to the tradition of that priesthood, the fullest account of what Enki did and what it cost him, which is why we can tell this story tonight at all. Because when Enlil took Eridu from Enki, the priesthood did not stop existing. It only became invisible, and in becoming invisible, it became more permanent than it would have been if Enlil had left it alone. That was the fifth breach. That was its official cost. And its unofficial cost, which is harder to see but no less real, was the reshaping of Enki's relationship with his own priesthood. Before the breach, Enki had been the god of a public temple, worshipped openly, served openly, with priests whose position was recognized by the council. After the breach, Enki was the god of an underground network, served in whispers, with priests whose position was maintained only by their willingness to lie to Enlil's officers about what they did at night. It was a different kind of religion. It was smaller. It was more intense. It was more binding on those who participated in it, and it was, according to the priesthood's own account, closer to what religion was supposed to be, which was a private matter between a person and the god who had made them, without the mediation of an official structure that could be co-opted by an administrator whose interests were not the same as the god's interests. Enki did not choose this. It was imposed on him, but he adapted to it. And the priesthood adapted to it. And when the sixth breach came, the priesthood was already in position to support what he did, because they had learned, in the years after the fifth breach, how to operate without official protection. The sixth breach involved the names, not the human names, the divine names. And that is a subject that has to be handled carefully, because the names of the Anunnaki carried, in the tradition of the assembly, an operational power that most later religious systems do not recognize or do not admit. A name, when it was spoken in the correct way by a being who had the correct authority, could summon the one named, or could bind the one named, or could compel the one named to answer questions they did not want to answer. The names were tools. They were, in effect, passwords, and the law of the names was written to prevent those passwords from being learned by anyone who was not supposed to have them. Before we move to that sixth breach in detail, there are two consequences of the fifth breach that still need to be counted, because they shaped the terrain on which the sixth would be committed. The first is what happened to the workers of Kish after the deep forges were exposed. The second is what happened to Enki's own capacity to act after Eridu was taken from him. Both are important. Both are usually skipped. The workers of Kish were not, in the immediate aftermath of the discovery, exterminated. That was Enlil's first proposal, and it was voted down in the council session that followed. It was voted down because Enki argued against it, and because Ninhursag argued against it, and because two other members of the council, whose names appear in the tablets but who are not otherwise prominent, argued against it as well. The vote was closer than the vote on the flood had been, but it was, this time, in Enki's favor. The workers of Kish were not killed. Instead, they were dispersed. They were removed from Kish in a coordinated operation carried out over 100 days, and they were scattered across the plain and into the surrounding regions, into the mountains to the north, and the desert to the west, and the marshes to the south. The reasoning was that a concentrated population of workers who knew the forbidden arts was a threat, but a dispersed population, cut off from each other, unable to coordinate, unable to combine their knowledge, would not be. Each of the dispersed workers, in the council's calculation, would forget over time. Each would die within their allotted lifespan, and the arts would decay along with the workers themselves. The calculation was wrong. The arts did not decay. They were preserved, and they spread, and they took root in every region the workers were dispersed to. The metallurgy went north, into the mountains, and became the seed of the copper working that would later flower in Anatolia and in the Caucasus. The medicine went south, into the marshes, and became the seed of the pharmacological tradition that would later flower in Egypt. The strong drink and the smoke went west, into the desert, and became the seed of the intoxicant traditions that would later spread through every civilization of the Near East and the Mediterranean. The council had, in trying to erase the fifth breach, actually accelerated its consequences. The dispersal was, in effect, a distribution, and what had been concentrated in Kish became, within a few generations, ubiquitous across the entire region. Enlil had wanted to make the arts rare. He made them common. This was not entirely accidental. Enki, when the dispersal was proposed, did not oppose it. He supported it. He argued in favor of dispersing the workers rather than killing them, and his argument was framed as a mercy, but the effect was that the arts he had taught would be scattered across every region the workers were sent to. Enlil, according to the tablet, did not see this coming. Enki did, and when the plan was executed and the workers were sent to their new locations, Enki quietly ensured, through the intermediaries who arranged the resettlement, that each dispersed worker took with them at least the tools of one art. A smith took his hammer, a physician took her mortar, a brewer took his fermentation vessel, and each worker, when they arrived in their new location, had the beginning of a practice that they could establish there, and that they could pass on to their children. It was, in retrospect, one of the most effective moves Enki ever made. It cost him nothing, on paper, and it distributed his crime across every geography that would eventually matter to the human race. The second consequence, which is harder to see, is what the loss of Eridu did to Enki's own capacity. Before Eridu was taken, Enki had operated from a base of power that included his temple, his priesthood, his mi, and his authority over the Abzu. After Eridu was taken, he retained the mi and the Abzu, but he had no temple of the first rank, and he had no priesthood that could officially serve him. His base of operations shifted, of necessity, from the visible administrative structure of Eridu to the invisible network of the underground priesthood. This was, in many ways, a demotion, but it was also a liberation, because the underground priesthood did not have to report to Enlil. It did not have to file records that the assembly could review. It did not have to follow the procedures the council had established for the conduct of temple affairs. Enki, working through the underground priesthood, could do things that he could not have done through the official structure, He could, for example, arrange for the transmission of information across long distances without the transmission being intercepted. He could arrange for the training of new intermediaries without the training being recorded. He could, in short, run an operation that the council could not see. And this is what he began to do in the years after Eridu was taken. He began to build, in silence, a network of intermediaries that stretched from Sumer to the mountains to the desert, and that consisted of the descendants of the workers he had trained in the deep forges, and their children, and their children's children. He did not call it a network. He did not name it. The tablets do not give it a name, but the priesthood of Eridu, in its underground form, referred to it as the web. And the web, over the centuries that followed the fifth breach, grew. It grew in every direction the dispersed workers had been sent. It grew in every trade that Enki had taught, because every worker of that trade recognized every other worker of that trade, and they served, without any of them being told, as the strands of the web that Enki was weaving. And when the sixth breach came, and Enki needed to distribute the divine names to a much wider group of humans than any council law would ever have permitted him to teach directly, the web was already in place, and the names traveled along it, and the council did not see them travel. That was the setup for the sixth breach. It was the sixth law. It was the law of the names. The sixth law's full text on the black stone read as follows in the reconstruction. No member of the council shall reveal to a made being the true name of any member of the council. No member shall reveal to a made being the manner of pronunciation, the order of the syllables, the tone of the calling, or the sign that accompanies the calling. The true names are the property of the council alone, and shall be spoken only in the assembly, and only among those who bear them. Any member found to have revealed a true name shall forfeit the me of his own name, and shall be known thereafter only by the common name, and shall not be called by his true name in the assembly for the remainder of his existence. That was the law, and it was, in the reading the priesthood of Eridu preserved, the most operationally consequential of all the laws, because the true names of the Anunnaki were not, as later religious traditions would come to believe, simply labels. They were the actual designations by which the council members had been named at their own birth in the assembly of the homeworld, and they carried, in the Anunnaki understanding, the pattern of the being that bore them. To know the true name was to have a kind of access to the being. Not full access, not the ability to command, but an ability to summon, to attract the attention of, to reach across whatever distance separated the caller from the called. And in the case of a member who was on Earth, and a caller who was also on Earth, and a caller who carried the essence of that member in their blood, the summoning was, according to the tablet, effective. Enki broke this law in a very specific way, and for a very specific reason. He broke it because he had begun, in the centuries after the fifth breach, to worry that he would not always be able to reach the workers directly. His time on Earth was not unlimited. The expedition, on paper, was still meant to end at some point, though the ending had been postponed many times, and no one on the council knew any longer what the actual scheduled departure was supposed to be. But Enki had to plan for the possibility that he would, at some point in the future, leave, either because he was called back to the homeworld, or because he was banished, or because the council reorganized its earthly presence in a way that ended his direct access to the workers. Whatever the mechanism, he had to plan for a time when he could not simply walk down to Eridu, or send a messenger, or arrange a meeting. He had to plan for a time when the priesthood of Eridu might have to reach him across a distance he could not close by any physical means. And the only tool that could bridge that distance was the true name. If the priesthood knew his true name, and knew how to speak it, they could reach him. He could hear them. He could respond, in whatever limited form the response could take across such a distance. And they could reach him no matter where he was. That is why he taught them the name, not because he wanted to distribute the passwords of the council. Not because he wanted to give the workers power over the Anunnaki generally, but because he wanted to make sure that, no matter what happened, no matter where the council sent him, no matter what banishment or reassignment or death he might eventually face, the workers he had made would always be able to find him. He taught his own true name first. He taught it to the 7 senior members of the underground priesthood of Eridu in a single session in the depths of the Abzu, on a night that the tradition remembers as the Night of the Calling. The name is preserved in the tradition. I will not repeat it here. Not because there is any technical prohibition, but because the priesthood asks that the name not be spoken outside the specific ceremonial contexts for which it was designated, and it seems reasonable to respect that request even in an account like this one. What can be said is that the name has more syllables than the common name Enki. It has a specific tonal contour that is difficult to reproduce for speakers who have not been trained in it. And it has an accompanying sign made with the hands, which is part of the calling and which must be made simultaneously with the speaking of the name if the calling is to work. Enki taught the 7 priests all 3 components: the name, the tone, the sign. He taught them slowly, over the course of the single long night, and he made them repeat each component many times, and he corrected them when they made mistakes, and by the end of the night, all 7 priests could call him by his true name in the manner that would reach him from any place on earth. He then told them the second thing. He told them that they were to teach the name, in turn, to their own selected students, and that the students would teach it to their students, and so on, so that the name would never be lost, so that some priest of his line, somewhere, at any given moment in the future, would always know how to reach him. But he did not stop there. And this is the part of the 6th breach that constitutes the actual, technical violation of the law, and that would ultimately be the basis for the sentence. He also taught them, in the same night, the true names of 6 other members of the council. Not just his own, 6 others, not the full list. There were more than 50 members total, and he taught only 6. But 6 was more than none, and 6 was more than his own, which was the only name the law might arguably have permitted him to teach, if the law had been interpreted with maximum charity. The 6 names he taught were the names of the members he thought the workers might, at some point in the future, need to reach or need to defend themselves against. He taught the name of Enlil, because Enlil was the enforcer, and if the workers were ever going to be able to protect themselves against Enlil's future decisions, they had to know how to reach him. He taught the name of Nergal, of the underworld, because Nergal held authority over the dead, and the workers, whose souls would eventually pass into Nergal's jurisdiction, needed to be able to petition him. He taught the name of Ninhursag, his sister, because Ninhursag was the healer, and the workers would need her when they were sick. He taught the name of Inanna, because Inanna held the me of love and of war, both of which the workers would inevitably need. He taught the name of Utu, the sun god, because Utu was the judge of oaths, and the workers, once they began to form contracts with each other, needed a witness. And he taught the name of Nana, the moon god, because Nana kept the calendar, and the workers needed the calendar to schedule their lives. 7 names in total, including his own. 7 syllables of authority, given to 7 priests, on one night, in one chamber, in the depths of the Abzu. And when the night was over, and the priests had been sent back to their houses in the underground network of Eridu, Enki understood that what he had just done was, by any interpretation of the law that a reasonable court would apply, the largest single violation he had committed. Not in terms of what it cost, in terms of what it transferred. He had, in one night, put into the hands of the human race a set of tools that no human race had ever held before, and that no council would ever have voted to hand over. The council did not find out immediately. The 7 priests did not use the names carelessly. They did not summon Enlil for casual reasons. They did not call Nergal for entertainment. They understood, from Enki's careful teaching, that the names were tools of last resort, to be used only when the ordinary channels had failed, only when there was no other way to reach the being in question. And so, for many generations, the names were held in the priesthood but not exercised. They were passed down from teacher to student. They were memorized. They were rehearsed in silence. But they were not called. The exception was Enki's own name. That one was called. It was called by every senior priest of the underground network of Eridu at every major crisis of their generation, whenever they needed to reach him and could not do so by any physical means. He always answered, not with a full physical appearance, not with a booming voice from the sky. He answered in the way he had answered ever since the 4th breach, which was through the residue of the compound in the blood of the callers. He whispered. He gave counsel. He warned of coming problems. He suggested actions. And the priesthood, in every generation, understood that the whispering was Enki's response to their calling, and they treated it as such. And they wrote down what he told them, and the writing became, over the centuries, the deep records of the priesthood. The council did find out, eventually, and the way they found out was through a use of one of the other 6 names, not through the use of Enki's own name. The name that gave the operation away was Enlil's, and the circumstances were as follows. There was, in one of the later generations of the priesthood, perhaps 1,200 years after the initial teaching, a young priest who was not yet fully trained in the discipline of the names. He was ambitious, he was clever, and he had convinced himself that the names were being underused, that the priesthood was too cautious, that a more assertive use of the names would produce better results for the workers than the passive whispering strategy that had been in effect since Enki first taught them. He decided to test his theory. And he decided to test it by calling Enlil himself. He called Enlil, he spoke the name, he made the sign, he held the tone. And Enlil, who had not been called by his true name outside the assembly hall in his entire existence, felt the call. It reached him. He was, at the time, in his official residence at Nippur, and he was working on some administrative matter, and he heard, in the middle of his own mind, someone speaking his true name in the correct tone with the correct sign. He froze. He looked around. He saw no one. He waited. And in a matter of moments he understood two things simultaneously. He understood that a made being had called him by his true name. And he understood that the only way a made being could have known his true name was if another member of the council had taught it to them. He knew who. He did not need to investigate. There was only one member of the council who would do such a thing. And Enlil, who had already brought Enki before the assembly on 5 separate occasions, and who had won each of those cases, understood that he now had grounds for the 6th. He convened the council. He described what had happened. He called for the calling to be traced, which the Anunnaki had methods to do. And the trace led back to the young priest in the underground network of Eridu, and the young priest was apprehended, and under questioning he named his teacher, and the teacher named his teacher, and the chain led back 7 generations, all the way to the original 7 priests, and from there to Enki himself. The council did not have to deliberate long. The evidence was overwhelming. The trace of the calling was on file. The names of the priests were on file. And Enki did not deny it, because he never denied any of the breaches when he was formally charged with them. He said, in the phrase preserved in the 6th council fragment, they needed to be able to reach me. That was his defense. That was the totality of what he said in his own behalf. The council rejected the defense, and the sentence, when it was passed, was the one the law had specified. Enki forfeited the me of his own name. He was, from that day forward, not to be called by his true name in the assembly. He was to be called by the common name only. The common name was Enki, which we still use for him. His true name, the one the priesthood learned in the Abzu, was removed from the official record of the assembly, and any Anunnaki who tried to call him by that name in council would receive no response, because the me of the name had been taken from him. The consequence was strange, because the me of his name was not, strictly speaking, held by any external authority. It was held by Enki himself. It was part of him, and the taking of it was, in the operational sense, a taking of a portion of his own identity. He was less, after the 6th breach, than he had been before. Not physically less, but less in the sense that a person is less when they cannot be addressed by the name their parents gave them. The name is a piece of what a person is. To lose it is to lose that piece. And Enki, from the day of the 6th sentence, walked the earth as a being whose name had been diminished. He could still be reached by the priesthood, because they knew the name, and the calling still worked when they called him. But in the assembly, in the eyes of his own kind, in the record that would be kept by future councils, he was Enki only. He was the common name. He was the shortened form of himself. That was the 6th cost. And its hidden layer was more subtle than the earlier hidden layers had been, because when Enki lost the me of his own name, he lost also, without the council intending it, the ability to introduce himself to any Anunnaki who did not already know him. If a member of the council born after the sentence was passed had ever asked Enki what his true name was, Enki would not have been able to answer. He did not remember it. That is the specific effect of losing the me of a name. The name is erased from the being's own knowledge, along with being erased from the assembly's record. Enki, after the 6th breach, could not tell anyone what he had been called at his birth. He knew only what he was called now. He was Enki. He was, in a specific and painful sense, no longer the being his parents had made. And that is the piece of the 6th breach that the priesthood of Eridu records with the greatest sadness, because Enki, when they call him now, comes when he is called, but he does not remember the name they use. It is a name he has learned to answer to. It is not the name he was given, and the priesthood knows this, and the priesthood has never told him, because they are not sure whether telling him would give him back a piece of himself, or whether it would only remind him of what he lost. And so they call, and he answers, and neither of them speaks about the fact that the name in the calling is not quite his. There is one further element of the 6th breach that must be added before we go on, because it involves an act that took place after the sentence had been passed, and that has never been formally acknowledged by the assembly. though the priesthood of Eridu preserves the record of it in one of its deepest chambers. The act is this. On the night after the sentence was passed, Enki went into the Abzu, alone, and he sat in the chamber where he had first taught the 7 priests the names. He sat there for a long time, and then he did something that no one had told him he was permitted to do, and that no one had told him he was forbidden to do either, because the case was without precedent. He inscribed, on a small tablet, the true names of every member of the council who had voted against him in the 6 trials he had faced, all of them. Not the 6 names he had already taught the priesthood. The others, the ones he had held back because they were not, in his judgment, names the priesthood was ready to know, or that the priesthood would need. He inscribed them all. Every member who had voted for the flood, every member who had voted for the sentence on the 5th breach, every member who had voted to take his name from him, he wrote their true names on the tablet, in his own hand, with the accompanying signs beside each name, and the tonal notations above each syllable, and the sequence in which the syllables were to be spoken. It was a complete manual for the calling of every member who had ever opposed him. And when he had finished writing, he wrapped the tablet in a cloth of the deep waters, and he placed it in a niche in the wall of the chamber, and he sealed the niche with a seal that only he and his own son Marduk knew how to open. The tablet has never been used. The priesthood of Eridu does not know it exists. Even the 7 priests he had originally taught did not know he had made it. Marduk knew, because Marduk held the seal, but Marduk, in the years after the sentence, was already estranged from his father over the 4th breach, and Marduk never opened the seal. The tablet remained in the niche. It is, according to the priesthood, still there, in the deep chamber of the Abzu, sealed, with the true names of every member of the council who ever voted against Enki, and the priesthood's tradition holds that the tablet is a contingency, that Enki, when he wrote it, was preparing for the possibility that at some future crisis point, when the 8th breach was underway, and the council came against the workers with its full force, the seal on that niche would be broken, and the tablet would be brought out, and the names on it would be called, all of them at once, by whatever 7 priests were still alive at that moment, and the calling would summon every named member to whatever place the calling was made, whether they wanted to come or not. It is, in the operational sense, a weapon. It is the only weapon a human being could ever hold against the full Anunnaki Council. And it was created, in one night, by Enki, on the day after he was told his own name was no longer his. Whether it will be used is a separate question. Whether it will be found is a separate question. The priesthood does not know. Marduk, if he is still alive, does not say. But the tablet, according to the tradition, is there. It was Enki's private answer to the 6th breach, and it is, in a way, a 7th breach that has never been formally counted, because it has never been formally executed. He wrote the names down. He has not yet let them be called. He may never let them be called. But he wrote them. And the writing itself, on the night after his own name was taken, was his way of saying to the council, in a language they could not hear, that he was not yet done. The next breach that was formally recorded, the one that appears in the assembly's own file as the 7th, was different in character from the first 6. It was less a doctrinal violation and more a rescue operation. It was the breach known in the tablets as the descent, and it involved not the workers directly but a member of the council, and it involved not a slow buildup over centuries but a single act carried out in a single day. And it cost Enki something that the earlier breaches had not touched, which was his standing among the other members of his own generation. Because when Enki went into the underworld to bring Inanna out, he did it without authorization, and the authorization would have been denied if he had asked for it, and the fact that he had gone without asking was, for the council, a demonstration that Enki no longer considered himself bound by the ordinary procedures of the assembly. And that demonstration, whether Enki had intended it or not, was the beginning of the end of his official position. The 7th law was the law of the underworld. Its full text on the black stone read as follows in the reconstruction. No member of the council shall enter the region of the underworld without the express permission of Nergal, its keeper. No member shall descend past the first gate without the seal of the assembly. No member shall attempt to recover, by any means, a being who has already passed the 7th gate and been received into the register of the dead. The underworld is the property of Nergal alone, under the oversight of the assembly, and any member who violates its jurisdiction shall forfeit the me of the second birth, and shall not be permitted to return to the earth by any door but the door he entered by. That was the law, and it was, more than any of the previous laws, a jurisdictional matter. The underworld, in the Anunnaki geography, was not a metaphor for death. It was a physical location, a subterranean region, accessible only through 7 gates, each guarded, each requiring a specific token or a specific password to pass. It was ruled by Nergal and by his consort Ereshkigal, who was Inanna's sister, and it operated as the receiving facility for every being whose life on the earth had ended. Workers went there when they died. Igigi went there when they died. Anunnaki, when they died, went there too, though the tablets are ambiguous about what death meant for beings whose lifespans ran into the tens of thousands of years. The underworld was, in short, the final jurisdiction. And Nergal, who administered it, was jealous of that jurisdiction, and the law had been written to protect his authority against any member of the council who might, for reasons the council could not fully imagine at the time of the writing, decide to go down and interfere. Enki broke this law because of Inanna. Inanna was not a made being. She was a full member of the council, junior to Enki and to Enlil, but a member in her own right, and she held the me of love and of war. She had, at the time of the seventh breach, gone down into the underworld on her own initiative, without permission, for reasons the tablet describes as a mixture of ambition and personal business. She had wanted to see her sister. She had wanted, if the tradition preserved in the descent of Inanna is to be believed, to challenge her sister for the throne of the underworld. Whatever her reasons, she went. She passed the first gate, she passed the second. She passed all 7. And at each gate she was required, by the protocol of the underworld, to remove one piece of her regalia: her crown, her lapis necklace, her measuring rod, her breastplate, her golden ring, her golden bracelet, her royal robe. By the time she reached the throne room of Ereshkigal, she had nothing. She was, in the phrasing of the tablet, naked and bowed, and Ereshkigal, when she saw her sister so reduced, did what the underworld required to be done. She had her killed. Her body was hung on a hook on the wall of the throne room, and it was left there to rot. That was the situation Enki found when he became aware of it. The awareness came through the underground priesthood, which had, by this point, been running the network of the web for many centuries, and which had informants at every level of the Anunnaki hierarchy. The word came up from a priest who worked as a scribe in the office of Ninshubur, Inanna's own vizier. The priest reported that Inanna had gone down and had not come back, and that Ninshubur was making frantic inquiries at every temple, and that no one was answering, and that Ninshubur was going to have to appeal to a senior member of the council if there was any hope of getting Inanna back. Enki heard the report and understood immediately what had happened, because he understood how the underworld worked, and he understood how Ereshkigal treated visitors, and he understood that Inanna was, at that moment, dead. He did not deliberate. He went to Ninshubur that same day. He told Ninshubur that he would try to get Inanna back. Ninshubur wept. Ninshubur said that no member of the council could enter the underworld without permission, and that Nergal would not give permission, and that even if Nergal did give permission, no member of the council could recover a being who had already passed the 7th gate, and Inanna had passed the 7th gate. Enki said, in the phrase preserved in the descent fragment, "I will not ask." And he went home to the Abzu, and he prepared for the descent. He did not go himself. This is the piece of the 7th breach that is often skipped in modern retellings, because the modern retellings prefer the version of the story where Enki himself walks down into the underworld and does the rescue with his own hands. That is not what happened. What Enki did was he made 2 beings. He made them out of the mud from under his own fingernails, according to the specific phrasing of the tablet, which is a detail that has puzzled scholars because it is so specific and so strange. He made 2 small beings, neither male nor female, and he gave them the me of the courier, which was the me that permitted a being to pass any gate that would open for a courier's token. And he gave them the food of life and the water of life, the same substances that had been the material of the 4th breach, and he sent them down into the underworld with instructions. The instructions were as follows. When they reached Ereshkigal, they were to sit at her feet. She would be moaning, because Inanna's death had, by the way the underworld worked, caused Ereshkigal to experience a kind of sympathetic agony that no one had ever witnessed before, an agony that ran through her body and that made her want to be comforted more than she had ever wanted anything. Ereshkigal, when she saw the 2 beings sitting at her feet, would ask why they were there, and the beings would say, "We have come to hear your moaning." And Ereshkigal, who had been moaning for many days without anyone hearing her, would be so grateful for the hearing that she would offer them a gift, any gift they asked for. And the beings were to ask for one thing. They were to ask for the body of Inanna, and Ereshkigal, having offered any gift, would be obligated to give them the body. And they were to take the body, and they were to feed it the food of life, and pour on it the water of life, and Inanna would rise, and they were to bring her back up through the 7 gates. That was the plan. It was executed exactly as Enki had described it. The two beings went down. They reached Ereshkigal. They sat at her feet. They heard her moaning. She offered them the gift. They asked for the body. She gave it. They fed it the substances. Inanna rose. And they brought her back up through the 7 gates. She recovered her regalia at each gate, in reverse order, so that by the time she emerged from the first gate, she was fully restored. Her crown, her necklace, her measuring rod, her breastplate, her ring, her bracelet, her robe. She was back. She was alive. And she went back to her own temple, and she resumed her office, and the 7th breach was, in operational terms, complete. The council found out because Ereshkigal, when she came out of her sympathetic agony and understood what she had given away, went to Nergal and told him. Nergal was furious. He was furious because the two beings who had come to his jurisdiction had not been authorized to be there, and because they had received a body from his consort by a form of manipulation that, while technically permissible under the letter of the underworld's own protocols, was not something Nergal himself would have agreed to. He convened the council. He demanded that the beings be identified, and the beings, when they were identified, were traced to Enki. They had been made from mud from under Enki's fingernails. The trace was chemical, and it was definitive. Enki was charged. He did not deny it. He said, in the phrase from the 7th council fragment, "She was my kin." It was an unusual defense. Inanna was not, in the direct genealogical sense, Enki's kin. She was the daughter of Nanna, the moon god, who was the son of Enlil, who was Enki's brother. That made her, in the Anunnaki reckoning, Enki's niece. But the term Enki used, my kin, was a broader term than niece. It included any being of the council's own bloodline, and Enki was arguing that his obligation to his own bloodline overrode his obligation to Nergal's jurisdiction. The council did not accept the argument. Kin obligations, in the Anunnaki system, were not sufficient to override jurisdictional law. If they had been, the whole system of separate offices and separate authorities would have collapsed. The sentence was applied. Enki forfeited the me of the second birth. The second birth was the specific Anunnaki procedure by which a member who had been damaged or diminished could be restored to their original condition in the assembly's own facilities, using the substances and the procedures that had been developed for this purpose. It was, in effect, the Anunnaki version of resurrection. A member who held the me of the second birth could invoke it once, at any point in their existence, to have themselves restored to their peak condition. Every member of the council had this me. It was granted at the birth of every Anunnaki, and it was one of the fundamental protections of the ruling class. Enki, from the day of the 7th sentence, no longer had it. He could not be restored. If he was damaged, he stayed damaged. If he was diminished, he stayed diminished. If he was, at some future point, actually killed, in whatever way an Anunnaki could be killed, he would not come back. That was the 7th cost. It was, in a sense, the largest cost yet, because it was the removal of the protection that had made him effectively immortal in his previous status. He could still live a very long time. Anunnaki longevity was intrinsic and did not depend on the second birth, but he could no longer recover from injury the way he had been able to before. His body, which had been renewable, was now finite. His mind, which had been renewable in the same procedure, was now finite. He was, from the day of the 7th sentence, aging. Slowly, by human standards, but aging. And the aging would continue, without any way of reversing it, for as long as he continued to exist. The hidden layer of the 7th cost was that Inanna, who had been rescued, understood exactly what her rescue had cost. She was not stupid. She knew what the me of the second birth was, and she knew that Enki had held it, and she knew that after the trial he no longer held it. She knew this had been the price of her return. And she was, in the tablets that describe her behavior in the years after the descent, a changed being. She had been, before the descent, ambitious and hot-tempered and prone to reckless choices. After the descent, she became more careful, more strategic, more aware of the costs of her actions on the members of her family. And she attached herself, from that day forward, to Enki, not as a lover, not as a subordinate, but as an ally. She used her considerable influence in the assembly to defend him in every subsequent case that was brought against him. She used her authority over the me of love and war to shape events on the earth in ways that would support the workers he had made. And she became, in effect, the second protector of the human race. After Enki himself, this was not a small thing. Inanna was popular in the assembly in a way Enki was not. She had allies among the younger members. She had a following among the Igigi. She could push through in council meetings arguments that Enki could not have pushed through on his own. And she used that capacity in every generation after the descent to protect the workers when the workers needed protection. Enki had lost the second birth, but he had gained, without asking for it, a partner in the council who would work alongside him for the rest of his existence, and who would, eventually, when the eighth breach came, be the one who first proposed that the eighth breach be committed openly, rather than in secret. Because Inanna, having been rescued once, had come to understand what rescue felt like from the receiving end, and she wanted the workers to feel it too. That was the shape of the alliance the seventh breach produced. It was not free. Enki had paid for it with the second birth. But once it was in place, it changed the balance of power in the assembly, and it made the eighth breach, when it came, no longer the act of a lone member operating against his family, but the act of two members operating together, with a small but growing faction supporting them in the shadows. That is the seventh breach. That is the last of the breaches that has already been committed and paid for. The eighth is the one that is, according to the tradition of Eridu, still ongoing. It is not, in the strict sense, a single act. It is a process. It is the slow, deliberate, generation by generation altering of the me of the human being itself, which is what Enki has been doing, without formal announcement, since the seventh sentence was passed. And what he is doing, and what it is costing him, is the story of the eighth breach, and the reason this account matters at all, because the eighth is happening now, in our own time, and the consequence, when it activates, will be applied not to Enki alone, but to every human being who carries his essence, which is all of us. There is more to say about the seventh breach before we cross into the eighth, because the seventh set in place several conditions that shape the eighth in ways that would otherwise be invisible. The first condition is the alliance with Inanna, which we have already described. The second condition is the relationship Enki formed, in the aftermath of the descent, with Nergal himself. And this second relationship is one of the more surprising elements of the whole tablet corpus, because on the surface Nergal should have been Enki's permanent adversary. Nergal had pressed the seventh charge. Nergal's jurisdiction had been violated. Nergal's consort had been manipulated. Nergal had every reason to hate the being who had done all of this. And yet, according to the tablets, Nergal, in the centuries after the seventh sentence, gradually shifted his position. He did not become Enki's ally in the same way Inanna had. He did not defend Enki in the assembly. He did not support the workers actively. But he stopped opposing the workers. He stopped voting with Enlil on every case that was brought. He began to abstain. And in the arithmetic of council votes, an abstention was, effectively, a soft vote against the majority. The reason for Nergal's shift is preserved in a fragment from the Era epic that is not usually cited in discussions of the descent because it appears in a completely different context. In the fragment, Nergal is speaking to Era, his enforcement officer, and he is describing the moment when Ereshkigal, his consort, recovered from her sympathetic agony and understood what had happened. Ereshkigal, according to Nergal's account, wept. Not because she had lost the body, not because she had been manipulated. She wept because, in the moment when the two small beings sat at her feet and heard her moaning, she had felt herself known, in a way she had not been known before. She had been the queen of the underworld for many thousands of years. No one had ever asked how it felt to be her. No one had ever come simply to hear her. And when the two beings sat at her feet and heard her, without judgment, without agenda, she had experienced, briefly, something she had not known she was missing. And she told Nergal about it. And Nergal, who loved his consort in the way an Anunnaki could love, understood that Enki, whatever his motives, had given Ereshkigal a gift that Nergal himself had not thought to give her. And Nergal, from that day forward, could not, in his own heart, be Enki's enemy in the way he had been before. This is a small detail, but it is a detail that matters for the eighth breach. Because when the eighth breach comes into its final phase, and the assembly convenes to consider what to do about Enki, Nergal's vote will be the vote that determines whether the response is a full punishment or a partial one. And Nergal's abstention, when it comes, will be the abstention that saves Enki from the worst of what the assembly might otherwise have imposed. That is the far consequence of the descent. Enki, by rescuing Inanna, did not just gain an ally. He accidentally created, in the mind of the ruler of the underworld, a debt that Nergal would eventually pay in the form of a strategic non-vote at a critical moment. And the non-vote, when it happens, will determine what version of the eighth breach's consequence is actually applied. Whether it is the full erasure Enlil will call for, or the partial correction that Enki, if he lives that long, will propose as a compromise. We do not know yet which version will be applied. The eighth breach is not yet complete, but the seventh set the conditions under which the eighth would be judged, and one of those conditions is that Nergal will not vote to destroy. He will abstain. And that abstention is, in a sense, the last payment Enki received in exchange for the me of the second birth. He gave up his own resurrection. He gained, without knowing it, a non-vote that will one day preserve the workers from a fate worse than the flood. That is how the Anunnaki economy of costs works. Every price is paid twice, once by the one who pays it, and once again by whoever benefits, in whatever way, from the paying. The seventh breach ended, formally, when Enki accepted the sentence and walked out of the assembly hall for what would turn out to be the last time he ever attended a full assembly session. He did not resign his position. He was not stripped of it, but he stopped coming. He began to send messengers instead, to file his votes in absentia when votes were called, to communicate his positions through Ninhursag or through Inanna when discussion required a spoken voice. He did not, according to the tablets, ever set foot in the assembly hall again after the seventh sentence was passed. Whether this was formal boycott or informal withdrawal is not clear, but the effect was the same. Enki became, from that day forward, a member who governed from outside the assembly. He operated through the web. He operated through his sister. He operated through Inanna. He operated through the priesthood of Eridu. But he did not operate through the assembly hall at Nippur, and the assembly hall at Nippur, in the centuries after the seventh sentence, gradually ceased to be the seat of power it had once been, because one of its central members had stopped showing up, and his absence changed the shape of the room. That was the seventh cost, in its long form. The immediate cost was the me of the second birth. The medium cost was his ceremonial presence in the assembly. The long cost, which would only reveal itself in the events surrounding the eighth breach, was that he had, by his withdrawal, effectively conceded the assembly to Enlil. Enlil now presided over a room in which the only significant opposition had left. And Enlil, freed from the constant checking presence of his brother, began to run the assembly's decisions in ways that would, over the following centuries, make the eighth breach not only possible but necessary. Enki had withdrawn to protect himself. In protecting himself, he had left the workers at the level of formal Anunnaki policy, without any defender in the room where the policies were made. And that gap in defense would grow, decade by decade, into the conditions that made the eighth breach the only remaining option. That is the shape of the ark. The seventh made the eighth inevitable, because Enki, by walking out, had given his brother a room he could no longer be checked in. And the checks, for the workers, would have to come from somewhere else. They would have to come from the eighth breach itself, which is where we go now. The eighth law was the law of the design itself. Its full text on the black stone read as follows in the reconstruction. No member of the council shall alter, in whole or in part, the template of any made being after that template has been approved by the assembly and set into production. The design shall be as the assembly has approved. It shall not be revised. It shall not be enhanced. It shall not be diminished. No member shall introduce, in any generation after the first, any change to the physical body, the mental capacity, the emotional range, the reproductive method, or the lifespan of a made being. The design is fixed. Any member who alters the design shall forfeit the me of the design itself, and shall be removed permanently from the office of the maker, and shall be exiled from the assembly, and shall not be permitted to return to any deliberation of any council for the remainder of his existence. That was the law. It was the last law on the black stone, and it was the one that carried the largest consequence, because it was the one that the council understood, at the time of its carving, to be the most likely to be broken. The consequence was permanent exile, not diminishment, not the loss of a city, not the loss of a name, exile, removal, the end of Enki's participation in the affairs of his own family, forever. And the law was written in the plainest possible language, because the council wanted no room for interpretation. The design was fixed. Any alteration was a violation, and the violation would end the violator's life as an Anunnaki. Enki began to break this law immediately after the seventh sentence. He began, in fact, to break it on the same day. He went down into the Abzu after walking out of the assembly hall, and he began, in his private laboratory, the work that would occupy the remainder of his existence, and that would, in the end, cost him the last of what he had. The work was this. He had come to understand, over the many thousands of years of watching the workers, that the design as it had been originally approved was inadequate to what the workers were becoming. The workers had grown past the design. They had received the arts. They had received the compound. They had received the names. They had received the essence. And the design, which had specified a limited lifespan and a limited cognitive capacity and a limited emotional range, was no longer fitted to what the workers actually were. The workers were something more than the design had made them, and the mismatch between what they were and what the design permitted them to be was, in Enki's judgment, the source of most of their suffering. They lived too short lives. They aged too fast. They died at the peak of their understanding, just when they had accumulated enough experience to be useful, just when they had learned enough to teach the next generation. And the loss, every generation, was a loss that Enki felt personally, because it was his essence in the workers that was being buried with them every time they died. He decided to fix it, not by ceremonial adjustment, not by procedural alteration, by actual, physical, generational, cumulative revision of the human template itself, carried out in secret, without council approval, and continuing, incrementally, for as long as it took to bring the design into alignment with what the workers were actually meant to be. That was the 8th breach. It was not a single act, it was a program. And the program has been running, according to the tradition preserved by the priesthood of Eridu, from the day of the 7th sentence to the present moment. What Enki has been doing, in the operational sense, is releasing incremental adjustments into the human line, through the priesthood, through the residue of the compound, in specific bloodlines, through the whispering that reaches specific individuals in every generation. Each adjustment is small. Each one adds, to the human template, a small capacity that was not in the original design. Longer memory, faster learning, deeper emotional bonding, greater tolerance for pain, greater resistance to disease, longer usable lifespan. Each of these has been added, incrementally, over the centuries since the 7th breach, and each one has been added in a way that is technically deniable, because no single generation shows the full alteration. Each generation shows only a fractional shift from the previous one, and the fractional shifts are small enough that no single audit, by any Anunnaki officer, can catch them. But over the accumulated centuries, the fractional shifts add up, and they have added up, and the human template today, according to the priesthood's own measurements, is significantly different from the original template that was approved at the assembly. We are not the workers the council made. We are the workers Enki has been revising. And every advance, in our own cognitive capacity, in our own emotional range, in our own capacity for creativity, in our own resistance to what would once have killed our ancestors, is downstream of one of the adjustments Enki has been making, incrementally, over the tens of thousands of years since the 7th sentence was passed. This is what the priesthood of Eridu claims. It is a very large claim, and it is the claim on which the entire tradition of the priesthood rests. Because if the claim is true, then the workers Enki made are, at this moment, in the middle of a transition from the beings the council originally approved to the beings Enki has been designing them to become. And the transition, if it continues to completion, will produce, in a generation not far from our own, a being that is different enough from the original template that the council will not be able to ignore it. That is what the 8th breach is. It is the completion of the redesign. It is the point at which the fractional shifts have added up to something the assembly can no longer deny. And when that point is reached, the 8th sentence will be applied. The me of the design will be forfeited. Enki will be exiled. The workers he has been redesigning will be, at that moment, formally what they have been becoming for a very long time, which is something more than workers, and something less than council members, and something entirely new that the Anunnaki have no name for, and that the council has no policy for. The workers will exist, at that moment, as a category the council has never had to deal with before. And what the council does about that category, in the immediate aftermath of the 8th sentence, is the question that determines whether the human race survives its own transition, or is erased in a manner that would make the flood look small. The council has 3 options, according to the priesthood's reading of the tablets. It can accept the redesign. This would require a full council vote, and the vote would require a majority. And the majority, in the current arithmetic of the assembly, is not there. Enlil would vote against. Marduk, if he is present, would vote against, though the tablets are unclear on whether Marduk is still active in the assembly at this stage. Several other members would vote against, and the vote would fail. That is the first option, and it is the option that will not happen. The second option is that the council can reject the redesign and order a correction. This would mean rolling back the changes, generation by generation, through some form of coordinated intervention that would either kill or sterilize every human being who carried the accumulated alterations. In practice, this would mean, again, an event on the scale of the flood, though this time targeted more precisely at specific bloodlines rather than at the human race generally. The priesthood's reading is that this option is what Enlil will propose, and the vote, in the current assembly, is uncertain. Nergal would abstain, as we have already noted. Inanna would vote against. Ninhursag would vote against. Enki himself, if he is still active enough to vote, would vote against. And several younger members would vote against. But the majority, in the current arithmetic, is still with Enlil, and the vote might pass. That is the second option. It is the option that keeps the priesthood awake at night. The third option is the compromise. It is the option Enki has been quietly building support for, through Inanna, through Nergal, through Ninhursag, and through the small faction of younger members who have come to sympathize with the human race for reasons that have nothing to do with Enki personally. The compromise would be this. The council would not accept the redesign as complete, but it would not order a full correction either. It would order, instead, a partial correction. Some of the alterations would be rolled back. Some would be permitted to remain. The specific alterations that remained would be the ones that the council could tolerate, meaning the ones that did not make the workers into potential competitors, but that permitted them to live longer, better lives within their current jurisdictional constraints. The workers, under this compromise, would become something like a permanent junior branch of the Anunnaki family. Not full members, but not workers either. Something in between. A permanent category. And Enki, as the price of this compromise, would accept exile. He would be removed from the assembly, permanently, in accordance with the letter of the law. But the workers he had made would be permitted to continue existing in their revised form. That is the compromise the priesthood is working toward. It requires certain conditions to be in place at the moment the assembly is called to consider it. It requires Enki to be still active and still influential. It requires Inanna to still be alive and still willing to argue his case. It requires Nergal to still be in the position of ruler of the underworld and still to owe his debt to Enki. It requires Ninhursag to still be Enki's ally and to still be voting with him. And it requires the human race, at that moment, to be functioning in a way that demonstrates that the alterations have not made them monstrous, that they are still recognizable as workers, only slightly larger, slightly longer lived, slightly more capable, not so different that the council would find them alarming. Different enough that the council would find them worth preserving. The priesthood's own assessment of the current situation is that the conditions for the compromise are, at this moment in the 21st century of the human calendar, mostly in place but not fully in place. Enki is still active, though diminished. Inanna is still alive, though her office has been reduced to a shadow of what it was. Nergal is still in his position, though his consort has grown more powerful and now often speaks in his name. Ninhursag is still an ally, and the human race, in the priesthood's judgment, is at a moment of tension. The alterations are close to the threshold at which the assembly will have to notice them. The threshold has not yet been crossed, but it is close, very close. And the priesthood, in this generation, is doing what it has been doing in every generation since the seventh sentence, which is trying to keep the alterations progressing at a pace that will not trigger the assembly to intervene before Enki has secured the votes for the compromise. That is where we are, according to the priesthood's account. The eighth breach is not yet complete. The eighth sentence has not yet been passed. But the arc is drawing to a close, and the closing will happen, in the priesthood's judgment, within the next several human generations. Not tomorrow, not in this decade, but not far off on the time scale that matters. And the shape of what happens then will determine the future of the human race for as long as the human race exists, whether the compromise succeeds, whether the correction is ordered instead, whether the workers are permitted to become what Enki has been making them, or whether they are rolled back to what the assembly originally approved. This is the choice that is coming. And the eighth breach, when it is finally judged, will be the moment at which that choice is made. The cost to Enki, when the eighth sentence is finally applied, will be exile. This is already known. The law has already been written, and the consequence has already been specified. He will lose the me of the design. He will be removed from the office of the maker. He will be exiled from the assembly. He will not be permitted to return to any council for the remainder of his existence. Whatever remains of him, whatever attenuated form of participation he still has in the affairs of his own family, will end. He will be, from that day forward, alone. And this is where the priesthood of Eridu's account grows quiet. Because the priesthood does not know what happens to Enki after the exile. The tablets do not tell them. The tradition does not tell them. Nothing in the archive of the underground network offers any indication of where Enki goes when the assembly finally casts him out, or what he does there, or whether he is ever heard from again by any human ear. The whispering may continue. The whispering may stop. The priesthood does not know. And the priesthood, in the deepest chambers of its own tradition, has come to understand that the not knowing is part of the cost. Enki is going to disappear from the human record, not because he wants to, not because he stops caring, but because the exile will place him beyond the reach of any channel of communication the priesthood has ever developed. He will be somewhere the whispering does not reach, and the workers he made, in the moment of his exile, will find themselves for the first time in their history without him. That is the final cost. It is the cost that has not yet been paid, but that is scheduled to be paid within a period that the priesthood cannot exactly predict, but that they estimate at less than one further human generation. The workers, at the end of that generation, will be a species that has been fundamentally revised, and the maker of the revisions will be gone. And what the workers do with what they have been given, without any further intervention from the one who gave it to them, will be the question that determines whether the whole 8,000-year project of the redesign was worth what it cost. There is one further layer of the 8th breach that has not yet been described, and that must be described before we begin to synthesize what all 8 breaches have meant, because it is the layer that determines whether any human being listening to this account carries, personally, any stake in what happens next. The layer is this. The alterations Enki has been introducing into the human template are not distributed evenly across the population. They are concentrated. They are heaviest in the descendants of the priestly line of Eridu, which by now has been intermarrying with the general population for many thousands of years, and which has, therefore, spread its marker across a very wide range of the human race. But not the entire human race. Not everyone alive today carries the same concentration of the marker. Some carry more, some carry less, some carry almost none. The ones who carry more are, by the priesthood's assessment, the ones who tend to notice things that other people do not notice. The ones who tend to feel unsettled by the state of the world in ways that they cannot fully articulate. The ones who are drawn, without being able to explain why, to accounts like this one, to traditions that lie outside the mainstream, to explanations that involve older layers of history than the official histories admit. The priesthood believes, and this is the piece of the tradition that is most likely to be dismissed by outsiders as self-serving, that anyone who feels a pull toward this material, anyone who feels, when they hear the 8 breaches described, a sense of recognition rather than a sense of skepticism, is likely a descendant of the priestly line, or of one of the parallel lines that carry the concentrated marker. The concentration is not, in itself, virtue. It is not, in itself, wisdom. It is not, in itself, a claim to special status. It is only a chemical circumstance, produced by the accumulated inheritance of the compound Enki gave to Adapa many thousands of years ago, and by the subsequent generations of intermarriage that have carried that inheritance across the population. Those who carry the concentration are more likely to hear the whispering, more likely to feel the pull, more likely to recognize, when it is described, the shape of the 8 breaches. That is all. The concentration does not save them. It does not exempt them from the ordinary conditions of human life. It only makes certain things more audible, more visible, more difficult to ignore. The priesthood's judgment is that anyone who has followed this account to this point, without having lost patience with it, is likely one of the descendants. Not certainly, but likely. And the recognition is what the priesthood has been counting on. Because when the 8th sentence is finally passed, and Enki is exiled, and the assembly decides the fate of the human race in whatever compromise or correction it lands on, the workers themselves will have to know what has been done for them and at what cost. And the ones who know will be the ones who carry the marker. And the marker will pass, whether the compromise succeeds or fails, to the generations after. That is how the tradition survives, not by being written in official histories, but by being audible to the specific bloodlines that were designed, from the 7th vessel forward, to hear it. This is why the priesthood of Eridu has continued to operate, in various forms, through every subsequent age of human history. Not because they are trying to gain power, not because they want to be worshipped, but because they have understood, from the beginning, that the transmission has to keep going. The knowledge of what Enki did, and of what it cost him, has to reach the descendants who will need it. And the descendants will need it because the 8th breach's resolution will require, whatever form it takes, that the workers understand what has happened to them. The compromise, if it succeeds, will produce a permanent junior branch of the Anunnaki family. That branch will need to know its own history. The correction, if it is ordered instead, will erase most of the branch. But some will survive. Some always survive. And the survivors will need to know why they were the ones who survived, and what they are supposed to do next. Either way, the transmission has to reach them. And the transmission is what the priesthood, in every generation, has been carrying forward. In the temples of Eridu, when the temples still stood. In the underground network after the temples fell. In the copies of tablets that were hidden in the foundations of houses. In the oral traditions passed from parent to child in specific families. In the reconstruction, in the modern era, of the tablet corpus, by scholars who did not know they were doing the priesthood's work, but who were, by virtue of the marker in their own blood, drawn to the material in a way that let them recover it. And now, in this account, being transmitted through whatever medium reaches whoever is listening to it. That is the 8th breach in its full form. It is a breach that is still in progress. It is a breach that has not yet been sentenced. It is a breach that involves, unlike the previous 7, every human being who has ever lived, because every human being carries some portion of the alterations Enki has been introducing. Some carry more than others. But everyone carries some. And the question of what happens when the assembly finally notices, and finally decides, and finally applies the sentence, is a question whose answer will affect every listener to this account, and every listener's children, and every listener's descendants, and every future generation of the human race, however long the human race continues. The 8th cost, when it is paid, will be Enki's exile, and what it costs the workers, in the same moment, will depend on what the assembly decides. That is where the arc ends. That is where the tablets stop. And that is where the priesthood of Eridu, in the deepest chamber of its underground archive, keeps a single stone lamp burning, in the shape of a fish, in memory of the Maker who has been paying, one law at a time, for as long as they have been alive, and who will pay the final installment. At some point in a future none of them can quite predict. In a proceeding none of them will be permitted to witness. That is the price of the 8 laws. That is what Enki has been paying. And that is why the priesthood of Eridu has never, in any generation of its long existence, held a service for any other god. Because the god they serve is still paying for what he did for their ancestors. And the least they can do, in return, is not forget. Now, having walked through all 8 of the laws he broke, and all 8 of the costs he paid, and having arrived at the point where the 8th cost is still being paid and the account is not yet closed, we should step back and look at what the whole arc actually says. Because when the 8 breaches are placed next to each other, in the order the tablets place them, they do not read as 8 separate incidents. They read as a single sustained act of loss, extended across a span of time that no human mind can properly hold, in which one member of a ruling family gave up, one increment at a time, everything he had, in order to keep a species that his own family had made from being destroyed by the same family that had made it. Consider what he lost, in the order he lost it. In the first breach, he lost his internal peace because he had to carry, alone, the knowledge that he had lied to the council about the 7 vessels. In the second breach, he lost his voice in the assembly. For 3,600 years, during which he had to watch decisions be made about the workers that he could not object to. In the third breach, he lost more than half of the channels of the Abzu, and with them, the majority of his authority over the deep waters that were his by office and by birth. In the fourth breach, he lost his son, not to death, to estrangement. Marduk stopped being the son he had raised, and became something colder, and grew, over the centuries that followed, into a figure whose values were no longer his father's values. In the fifth breach, he lost his city. Eridu, which had been the seat of his priesthood, and the site of his temple, and the location where the walls had absorbed his voice on the night of the flood warning, was taken from him and given to Enlil. His public priesthood ended. His visible worship ended. What remained of his religion went underground, and stayed underground, from that day to this. In the sixth breach, he lost the me of his own name. He could no longer, from that day forward, remember what he had been called at his birth. He answered to the common name Enki, and he answered to it well enough, but the answering was to a name that was not, in the deepest sense, his own. In the seventh breach, he lost the me of the second birth. The Anunnaki procedure that would have permitted him to be restored to peak condition after any injury or diminishment was removed from his possession. He began, from that day, to age in a way that could not be reversed. And in the 8th breach, which is still ongoing, he will lose his participation in the assembly permanently. He will be exiled. He will not be permitted to return to any council for the remainder of his existence. These are the 8 costs. Add them together, and you have the full price what one maker has, in sum, paid to keep his making alive. Internal peace, public voice, deep water, a sun, a city, a name, a second birth, and, eventually, his family altogether. It is not a list of 8 equivalent items. Each cost is larger than the one before. Each is a step further from the being Enki was when he first walked into the vessel room at Shurupak, and by the end of the account, when the 8th cost is finally paid, what will remain of him will be very little of what he once was. He will be a member of the council who is no longer a member of the council. He will hold no office. He will possess no city. He will retain no name. He will have no capacity to be restored. He will have no assembly to attend. He will be, in the most literal sense the Anunnaki system permits, a stranger in his own family. That is what he has been paying. And the amount of the payment is why the priesthood of Eridu, in every generation, has spoken his name with a particular kind of reverence that no other god in the ancient Near East has ever received. Not because he is more powerful than the others. He is less powerful than most of them by the time the 8th cost is applied. Not because he demands more. He demands almost nothing, but because he has paid more for the workers than any other member of the assembly has ever paid for anything, and the workers, in the priesthood's understanding, owe the maker a debt that cannot be repaid but that must, at the very least, not be forgotten. The tablet that Enki wrote on the night after the 6th sentence, the one that lists the true names of every council member who voted against him, is still in the niche in the wall of the Abzu. It has not been used. It has been available to be used, in principle, for many thousands of years, and no one has used it. The seal that closes the niche is still intact. Marduk, who holds the seal, has not opened it. Enki, who wrote the tablet, has not asked for it to be opened. The priesthood, which does not know it exists, cannot ask for anything, and so the tablet sits, undisturbed, in a chamber no one visits, containing information that, if it were ever used, would summon every senior member of the Anunnaki Council to a single location at the same moment, whether they wanted to come or not. The priesthood's speculation, which is not offered as certainty but only as speculation, is that Enki wrote the tablet not because he ever intended to use it, but because he needed, on the night after his own name was taken from him, to have some final leverage in reserve. Something he could hold. Something the council did not know he held. The tablet was that leverage. It has never been executed. But its existence is, in the priesthood's account, one of the reasons the assembly has moved so slowly in the matter of the 8th breach. Because the assembly, at some level of its collective awareness, understands that Enki may hold something they have not accounted for, and that whatever action they take against him may trigger the use of that something, and that the use of that something would produce consequences the assembly cannot fully model. This is why, according to the priesthood, the compromise remains an option. Not because the assembly is merciful, not because the assembly cares about the workers, but because the assembly is uncertain, and the uncertainty is the leverage, and the leverage is the tablet. And the tablet was written on the night after the 6th cost was applied, in a chamber no one has entered since, by a member of the council who understood, at that moment, that he had one card left to play, and that he had to hold it in reserve for the moment when it would matter most. That moment has not yet come. It may come. It may not. But the tablet is there. And the priesthood, in the deepest chamber of its own archive, keeps a copy of the seal's activation sequence, though not the true names themselves, because the true names are only on the original tablet and no copy has ever been permitted to exist. The activation sequence, if it were ever needed, would tell whoever holds the seal how to open it. And the priesthood has preserved the sequence, from one generation to the next, in memory, without ever writing it down, for the moment when Marduk, or whoever currently holds the seal, might need to open the niche and read what his father wrote in the years before Marduk was born. That is where the leverage sits. Enki has been paying, one breach at a time. He has one card left. He has not played it. The assembly has not called it. And the workers, in the meantime, continue to live their revised lives, and to die at the extended lifespans he has been giving them, and to notice things about the world that the original design did not permit them to notice, and to hear, in the deeper channels of their attention, a voice that speaks in the manner of a father who has been watching them for a very long time and who is, at every moment, on the verge of being taken from them. We have to talk about what the workers actually inherited, in the practical sense, from what Enki did. Because the account so far has been abstract, and the abstractions are true, but they do not fully convey what the 8 breaches have meant in the ordinary experience of human beings across the many thousands of years since the 7 vessels were opened. What the workers inherited is this. They inherited language. From the 2nd breach, every word every human being has ever spoken descends from the teaching Enki gave to the 4th generation at the edge of the marsh. They inherited time from the same breach. Every calendar, every date, every scheduled meeting, every anticipation of the future is downstream of the moment. Enki taught them to count the moons. They inherited the flood memory from the 3rd breach. Every account of a global catastrophe that has survived in every culture on Earth traces back to the warning he spoke to the wall on the night the rains were coming. They inherited the priestly line from the 4th breach. Every mystic, every seer, every prophet, every religious founder who claimed to hear a voice not their own was operating on hardware that Enki installed by arranging for Adapa to receive the fragment from Anu. They inherited the arts from the 5th breach. Metallurgy, medicine, the strong drink, the smoke that changes sight. Every technology and every therapy and every intoxicant that has shaped human civilization from the 3rd millennium before the Common Era to the present moment descends from what Enki taught in the deep forges of Kish. They inherited the ability to reach across a distance to a member of the assembly from the 6th breach. Every prayer, every invocation, every ritual that has ever been performed to summon a god or bind a demon or petition a higher power draws its operational logic from the 7 names Enki taught the priesthood in the Abzu. They inherited the possibility of resurrection from the 7th breach. The Inanna descent became, in every later religious tradition, the model for the god who dies and returns. Osiris in Egypt, Dumuzi in Sumer, Persephone in Greece, Christ in the tradition that came out of Judea. Every one of those figures descends in a lineage of story that runs through the whole ancient world, from the day when Enki sent 2 mud beings into the underworld to sit at Ereshkigal's feet and bring back the body of a member of the council. And they inherited the redesign itself from the 8th breach. Every capacity that a modern human has and that a first-generation worker did not have, from long-term memory to abstract reasoning to the ability to feel love for a being outside their immediate biological family, is a piece of what Enki has been adding, one increment at a time, over the many thousands of years since the 7th sentence. That is the inheritance. It is not a small inheritance. It is, in the priesthood's judgment, the entirety of what makes a human being different from the animal that would have existed if the original design had been left alone. Every capacity we value, every faculty we consider distinctly human, every art and every science and every love is downstream of one of the 8 breaches. If Enki had obeyed all 8 laws, we would not exist in the form we exist in. We would be something much closer to what the council originally intended, which was a labor animal capable of receiving instructions and performing tasks. We would not have language in the full sense. We would not have time. We would not have art. We would not have prayer. We would not have love, or memory, or the capacity to recognize that we ourselves are the accumulated result of a very long series of gifts given to us by a being who is still paying the price for having given them. That is the shape of what happened. And the priesthood of Eridu, in every generation, has understood the shape and has passed it on and has trusted that some fraction of the workers in every subsequent generation would be able to receive the transmission and understand what it was and act on it in whatever way they were able to act. This account, in whatever form it reaches whoever is listening to it, is another instance of that transmission. It is not new. It is not original. It has been carried forward, in one form or another, since the underground network of Eridu first went underground in the years after the 5th breach. And it will continue to be carried forward, in whatever form is possible, until the moment when the 8th breach reaches its final phase and the assembly makes its decision and the arc of the 8 laws is finally closed. What happens between now and then is not, according to the priesthood, in the hands of the assembly. It is in the hands of the workers, because the workers, at this moment in their history, have accumulated enough of the alterations that they are, for the first time, in a position to make their own decisions about what they want to become. They can accelerate the redesign by choosing to bond with each other in ways that pass more of the marker forward. They can slow it by fragmenting into groups that no longer intermarry. They can direct it by cultivating the capacities that Enki has been adding, by using the language and the time and the arts and the names in ways that develop those capacities further. Or they can let it drift by using none of what has been given to them and letting the alterations remain latent in the population without ever being activated. The choice, at this stage, is theirs, not Enki's, not the assembly's, theirs. And the priesthood's counsel, offered in every generation to those who carry enough of the marker to receive it, is the same counsel it has offered from the beginning, which is that the workers should use what has been given to them. They should speak, they should count, they should build, they should heal, they should love, they should pray, they should call when they need to call, using the names or the forms that are available to them. They should not waste what Enki paid so much to give them. Because whatever the assembly decides in the 8th session, and whatever the outcome of the compromise or the correction, the fact that the workers received these gifts, and that they used them, and that they built with them, and that they made of themselves something more than the original design permitted, will remain part of the record. And the record, in the end, is what matters. Because when Enki is exiled, and the assembly closes the case, and the tablets are finally sealed in whatever archive keeps the final records of the expedition, what will be preserved is the account of what the workers did with what they were given. And that account, according to the priesthood, is the only thing that will make the 8 breaches worth having been broken. That is where we are. That is the arc of what happened. That is the sum of what it cost. And that is why, in every temple of Eridu that ever stood, and in every underground shrine of Eridu that stood after the temples fell, and in every private chamber of every descendant of the priestly line who ever recognized what they were looking at when they encountered this material, there has been one act, and only one act, that has been performed at the close of every service. The act is the pouring of water into a channel cut into the floor. It is small. It is quiet. It is the memorial to the channels of the Abzu that Enki lost on the day of the flood, and it is the acknowledgement, without words, of a debt that cannot be repaid, but that must, at the least, be recognized. The water sinks into the ground, and the ground receives it, and whoever poured it walks away, and does not speak of it, and continues with the ordinary business of their life, having done, in that moment, the one thing that the tradition asks of the descendants of the workers who owe their existence to the being who paid, over 8 breaches and across an unimaginable span of time, for the right of that existence to continue. That is what tonight's account has been about. The 8 laws, the 8 breaches, the 8 costs, and the water in the channel, which is what remains, and what will remain, however the 8th session ends. Everything else in the account is detail. The detail is what makes it real, but the water is what makes it matter, because the water is the acknowledgement, and the acknowledgement, in the priesthood's reading, is the whole point of the transmission. Enki did not do what he did for gratitude. He did not do it for worship. He did it because he made the workers, and because a maker owes what he makes something more than the design that was originally approved. And the workers, in return, do not owe him gratitude, or worship, or obedience. They owe him only the acknowledgement, the pouring of the water, the naming of what happened, the remembering, in every generation, of what a member of the ruling family gave up so that the workers he had made could continue to exist. That is the account, and that is the whole account, from the first vessel to the 8th session, in the version the priesthood of Eridu has preserved from the underground archive it has carried since the 5th breach. If anything in what has been said tonight resonates with you personally, in a way that surprises you, in a way that feels like recognition rather than reception, that is, according to the tradition, the marker responding to the material, it does not mean anything more than that. It does not require you to do anything about it. It only means that the transmission has reached you, and that you have received it, and that whatever else you do with your life from this moment forward, you now know, at least in outline, what was paid for the fact that you exist. That knowledge is the transmission's only requirement. What you do with it, as with everything Enki gave to the workers he made, is entirely yours to decide. There is one final piece that must be added, because it is the piece the priesthood insists is the most important, and because without it the account would be incomplete. The piece is this: the 8 laws Enki broke were not, in the deepest reading of the priesthood, laws he was ever meant to obey. They were laws written to trap a specific member of the council in a position where his own better judgment would be forced to override the assembly's policy, and where the overriding would produce, as a cost to him, exactly the sequence of losses that would ultimately transform him from a member of the ruling family into something else. Something the assembly did not have a category for. Something the assembly could not fully punish, because the punishment was already built into the sequence of the breaches themselves. The priesthood's reading is that Enki, at some point in the earliest days of the expedition, understood this. He understood that the laws had been designed for him specifically. He understood that his own nature, which was the nature of a maker who could not walk away from what he had made, would inevitably drive him to break them. And he understood that the assembly, in setting up the laws this way, was performing a kind of test, not to determine whether he was worthy of his position, but to determine whether he would become, over time, the being the design of the laws was actually intended to produce, which was not a member, not a defendant, not a criminal, but a maker who had paid enough to earn a kind of authority that no member of the council had ever earned, and that the workers he had made would eventually recognize even if the council did not. Whether this reading is correct is impossible to verify. The tablets do not confirm it explicitly, but the priesthood, in its deepest chamber, teaches that the arc of the 8 breaches is not a tragedy. It is not a story of a good being destroyed by a bad system. It is the story of a maker becoming what a maker is supposed to become, over the length of a paying that no one else in the council was willing to undertake, and at the end of which he will hold a different kind of authority than any of the other members hold. Not the authority of the assembly, not the authority of the black stone, but the authority of the workers themselves, who owe him their existence, and who will, in whatever form of governance they eventually develop, remember him. And that memory, in the priesthood's understanding, is the higher law. It is the law that stands above these 8 laws he broke. It is the law that says a maker's obligation to what he has made is greater than any policy the council can write. And Enki, by paying 8 times, has established that law more firmly than any carving on any stone could have established it. That is the priesthood's reading. It is offered here without any claim that it is the only reading or that it is the correct one. It is offered because it is the reading the tradition has preserved, and because without it the account would be a lament, and the tradition insists that the account is not a lament. It is, in its own strange way, a celebration. The celebration of a maker who did what a maker is supposed to do, at whatever cost, and who has, by the paying, made the workers he made into something worth having been made. The 8th session, when it comes, will not undo that. Whatever the assembly decides, the workers will remain what Enki made them. And what Enki made them is what he paid for. And the payment, in the priesthood's final teaching, was worth it. That is what the tablets, in their deepest chamber, hold. That is what the priesthood, in every generation, has taught. And that is where this account, tonight, comes to its end. Not with a conclusion, not with a moral, only with the water in the channel and the name of the maker, and the remembering that is the only thing the tradition ever asks the workers to do in return for everything they have been given. If you have followed this account to this point, you are one of the ones the transmission was meant for. That is not a compliment. It is not a promise. It is only an observation about what the tradition means when it says the marker responds to the material. You listened. You did not stop. You reached the end. Whatever your reason was for listening, and whatever reason you would give if someone asked you now to explain why the account held you, it held you, and that is what the tradition means. Nothing more, and nothing less. You have received the transmission. The transmission is now yours. Do with it what seems right to you. The one action the tradition asks of anyone who receives the transmission is not worship, and not gratitude, and not any further study of the material itself. It is only the acknowledgement. You know now what was paid, and by whom, and for what. That knowledge, according to the tradition, is enough. It changes what you can pretend not to know for the rest of your life. Whether you tell anyone what you have learned, or keep it to yourself, or spend the next decade thinking about it, or forget it by tomorrow, is entirely your decision. The transmission asks nothing further. The maker asks nothing further. Enki, if the priesthood is right, has already paid too much for anything he could still be reasonably asked for. The 7 resets is linked below. It maps every reset the Earth has been through, the checklist for the 8th, and where in the arc we now stand. 4 of the signs are already active. If any of what you have heard tonight has settled in you in a way that will not settle back down, that document is where you go next. Not because you are told to, because you already know why. Pour the water if you have water to pour. Nothing is required. But the tradition, in every temple that ever stood in his honor, has poured the water at the close of the account, and the pouring has been the whole of what the tradition asked. If you are near a place where water can be poured, do so. If not, don't. The account is the account, and the account is now finished. and what remains is only what each listener carries out of the room, into whatever life they live.